Good morning. Speakers are working well. I'd like to call this meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council on Thursday, February 22nd, 2018 to order and begin with the roll call starting on my right.
Tatayan here.
Fiorini here.
Thompson here.
We have a quorum. On to file item number 5, the adoption of the January 25th, 2018 meeting summary.
Just one slight correction at the top for review and adoption by the council at the February 22 meeting, today's meeting. It says January 25, and that's it. I think it's ready to adopt with that correction.
With that correction, we have a motion to adopt. Do we have a second? Thompson seconds. Let the record show that Councilmember Weinberg is now present, and we will proceed to the vote on file item number 5.
Weinberg, aye.
Tatayan, aye.
Fiorini, aye. Motion passes unanimously. Chair's report, file item number 6. The only thing I wanted to cover is that we have our next Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting scheduled for April 16th. The traditional pre-meetings with each of the 15 other state and federal agencies has begun. The agenda is beginning to take shape, and it looks like there will be 2 primary topics to cover. One will be the coverage of our ecosystem chapter amendment, as well as an update on ecosystem restoration activities in the Delta. Our goal is to use the April meeting to set up a meeting in November to be able to offer up a vision for what habitat restoration and ecosystem changes should look like over the next 5 years. Again, a part of the ecosystem chapter work that we're underway now. The other main thrust that we anticipate at the DPIC meeting will be a continuation of a review of science activities, furthering a work to coalescing the agencies around the One Delta, One Science theme, as well as highlighting the work that's underway with the 5-year review and possible updates to the Delta Science Plan. So are there any questions on the work thus far underway for DPIC? No? All right. With that, then, we will move on to file item number 7, Executive Officers Report. Jessica Law.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Fiorini and council members. So later today, we are hosting an open house on the ecosystem amendment to review some of the science behind the potential amendment. I wanted to make sure that everyone here and everyone watching online is aware that we've changed locations. So we had originally planned for Walnut Grove, and we are now in Cortland. We will be at the Cortland Auditorium at 146 Primusing Avenue in Cortland. Additional information is on our website, but please make sure that you go to Cortland instead of Walnut Grove. The meeting is from 5 to 7 p.m. We'll have brief overview presentations, and then staff and consultants will be available to answer questions and discuss issues such as past and future effects of climate change and sea level rise, best available interdisciplinary science applied to the ecosystem, adaptive management practices, and how we can learn from adaptive management and our experiences, and then desired landscape scale ecological outcomes. So it should be a really great open house, and we're looking forward to talking with folks a bit more. So since we last met, there has been one covered action that has filed a certification of consistency and is in the public review period currently, and then 2 that were in the public review period that have passed without appeal. On February 2nd, the California Department of Parks and Recreation, Division of Boating and Waterways, certified that its aquatic invasive plant control program is consistent with the Council's Delta Plan. This is an adaptively managed program designed to keep the waterways navigable by controlling growth and spread of invasive aquatic plants in the Delta, its tributaries in the Sassoon Marsh. The program incorporates the previous Delta programs conducted by Boating and Waterways, including those for water hyacinth, sponge plant, and a few others. Any new invasive plant species will be incorporated into this program as outlined in legislation passed in 2013. Two covered actions, then the Yolo Basin completed public review without appeal, Yolo Flyaway Farms, and Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area Habitat and Drainage Improvement Project. I talked about these at the last council meeting. Yolo Flyaway Farms is about 381 acres. It's mostly intertidal and subtidal marsh, and it will improve drainage to protect water quality and minimize introduction of agricultural contaminants. Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area Habitat and Drainage Improvement Project. It's located along the northernmost boundary of the legal delta and includes 5 major components to enhance fish and wildlife's ability to manage wetland resources and agricultural operations in the Yolo Basin Wildlife Area. For Delta Plan implementation and coordination letters, staff submitted 2 comment letters in February related to Delta Plan implementation. On February 14th, we submitted a letter to the Department of Water Resources on the draft environmental impact statement, EIR-EIS, for Yolo Bypass Salmonid Habitat Restoration and Fish Passage Project. The project's intended and consists of 2 actions described in the National Marine Fisheries Service biological opinion, and it's needed in order to remain in compliance with the Endangered Species Act, Federal Endangered Species Act. Restoration, these 2 actions are restoration of floodplain rearing habitat through increased seasonal inundation within the lower Sacramento River Basin, and then reducing migratory delays and loss of salmon, steelhead, sturgeon, and others through the modification of the Fremont Weir. And then the last letter, so most recently on February 20th, we submitted a letter to the Department of Water Resources on the draft water plan update in 2018. If you remember, the council heard a presentation in November from Kemi Argabechi at the Department of Water Resources, who's the lead author on that. The plan's focus is really on sustainability, and we think that that's on the right course. But as we described in greater detail in our letter, and there's a copy in your binders, we encourage the department to elevate the co-equal goals as a guiding policy in the plan. The work that's necessary to achieve water reliability, goal for the entire state, is really inextricably linked with the health of the Delta ecosystem. So we encourage them to look at the Delta Plan, Co-Equal Goals, and Delta Reform Act. Council staff will continue to stay engaged in the process, including attending steering committee meetings. A few personnel announcements. I am very excited and very pleased to announce Jeff Henderson, who is our new planning director. Jeff's here. This is day 4 for him. Jeff has over 23 years of experience in land use and environmental planning. Much of his experience centers on preparing and managing general plans and multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plans, local coastal programs, sustainability, climate action plans, and CEQA analysis and compliance. Several of these projects have been in the Delta, and his work, including he contributed to the original 2013 Delta Plan. They provided him with a really strong working knowledge of the Delta Reform Act, the co-equal goals, and policy and regulatory complexity of our work. We are very thrilled to have him here. So you will be hearing more from him soon. Also, I am very, very excited to announce that Governor Brown has appointed Amanda Bohl, who's also here, to be the new Special Assistant for Planning and Science. This is a role where she will be primarily coordinating for the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee and helping out with a whole host of other projects that we have going on internally. Amanda is no stranger to DPIC. She has been helping coordinate and facilitate and organize those meetings for the past 2 years. She's a critical member of our team, and we are just thrilled that she is in this new position. So, congratulations, Amanda. Yay. Another staff announcement, so Lita Bridey, who is a staff member, she's been at the council for about 3 years in the planning division. She is moving over to the communications division and will be the public participation specialist. She will be helping the council on council meetings, and we are very happy to have her in this role. She's got a ton of experience with Delta Plan implementation, and I think she'll provide great support to the council. So you'll be seeing her at future meetings. She has a degree in communications, and she's been working steadily on projects like Delta View, administrative performance measures, and we're just thrilled to have her be supporting the council in her new role. So, last personnel announcement, we have a new Sea Grant Fellow. As you know, the council supports about 3 or 4 Sea Grant Fellows every year. Our newest fellow, Stephen Pang, is going to be working in the Planning and Performance Division. I have Stephen's here. Oh, he's in the back. Okay. Stephen comes to the council. He's wrapping up his master's degree at Moss Landing Marine Labs, where his thesis research examined the effect of size-selective fishing. And he has a bachelor's degree in oceanography from the University of Washington and has spent a lot of time doing fisheries research in Idaho, Central Washington. He is helping the Planning and Performance Division with the ecosystem amendment, performance measures, and a few other projects, and we're very happy to have him too. So with that, I think we're ready. We do not have a legal update today.
Correct.
And Ryan Stamber, I'd like to call you up for the legislative update.
Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, council members. Last Friday was the bill introduction deadline for the second year of the 17-18 legislative session, with more than 1,000 bills coming into print over the weekend. As a result, I'll be highlighting the most relevant bills over the course of the next couple council meetings, starting with a handful today. The first bill I'd like to highlight in your binders is AB 2053 by Assemblymember Bill Quirk from Alameda, which would establish a harmful algal bloom task force to be led by the state board. Among the group's charges would be a prioritization of actions and research needed to prevent or mitigate such algal blooms in California waters. As the council is aware, the benefits and challenges posed by nutrients in terms of delta water quality have been a point of emphasis in recent years. For instance, the Central Valley Regional Water Board released a nutrient research plan for the delta just last month for comment. Also, the council's science program is co-funding research to determine baseline water and ecosystem conditions in advance of the Sacramento Regional Sanitation Plant upgrade. This project is expected to significantly change the nutrient load of the plant's effluent, and I think it's something that the science program is very excited to be funding. Moving on to SB 1015 by Senator Ben Allen from Santa Monica. This addresses the state's climate adaptation efforts on a statewide level. Specifically, SB 1015 would establish a climate resiliency program focused on mitigating the impact of climate change in rural and urban communities, with an emphasis on enhancing the resiliency of natural systems and working lands. Certainly some tie-in with the work that we're doing on the ecosystem amendment potentially there. The program would be managed by the Wildlife Conservation Board and would be funded by the state's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. As the council will also recall from the January presentation on 2018 priorities, the topic of climate adaptation will also be a point of emphasis for the organization this year as staff begins scoping a climate vulnerability assessment for the Delta. And then the final bill I'll discuss this morning is SB 919 by Senator Bill Dodd from Davis. This measure, upon appropriation from the legislature, would require the state board to develop a plan to deploy a network of stream gauges based upon gaps in existing monitoring efforts. While the bill is intended to apply statewide, the potential benefits to the Delta could be meaningful. For instance, of the 500 stream gauges deployed by USGS statewide, 35 are in the Delta and currently relied upon to collect data on a number of variables, including contaminants, nutrients, salinity, and temperature. As the council should be familiar with, also in 2016, Senator Bill Dodd authored a piece of legislation on improving environmental data management. That was AB 1755, which is currently being implemented by DWR with input from the Delta Science Program and others. From the council's perspective, the need for improved data collection and management is called out not only in the Delta Plan, but also more recently in the Science Action Agenda. The three bills are eligible to be heard in their first policy committees by the end of March. And then turning to the November ballot, where a water bond being proposed by Jerry Merrill recently submitted its signatures for certification. The $8.9 billion bond would allocate funding for a variety of water and habitat-related projects, as well as provide $5 million for the council's science program. Assuming the initiative's proponents meet the signature threshold, the initiative will be included on the November ballot, which will also include a parks bond, SB 5, which was signed by the governor last year. And then finally, turning to Capitol Hill, where last month the deadline for Congress to ratify the drainage settlement between Westlands and the Department of Interior passed once again without action. As you'll recall, in September 2015, federal officials came to an agreement with Westlands that relieved the federal government of its obligation to provide drainage for land in the water district while forgiving the debt Westlands owes for the construction of the Central Valley project. While the passing of the deadline is notable, assuming both sides agree to exercise the 12-month extension provision in the accord, the negotiated settlement will remain intact and continue to await congressional action. And with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions, Ryan? Frank?
Yes. Is it possible, Ryan, that you could provide council members with a map of the Senate districts and the Assembly districts? It'd be interesting to know oftentimes where members come from, and it's not always, I just don't know exactly the names and identify them with areas, but that would be helpful.
Certainly. I'd be happy to do that.
Others? Ken?
Excellent report, Ryan. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have like a few pieces of legislation I just want to kind of note, and maybe they help advance some of the things that we're trying to do, especially some of the recent amendments. AB 2060 and AB 2064, I happen to be familiar with the issue, in my previous life in terms of nonprofits and NGOs that were doing restoration work. They have a more challenging cash flow issue than public and governmental agencies. So I'm wondering, one question is, and maybe a comment attached to it is that, could these IRWM grants and advancing 50% of the grant, can that help with some of the nonprofits that are doing restoration or acquiring, land for restoration, that kind of thing? So maybe this is a tool that we should think about as moving the ball forward. There was, let's see, 919, sort of before I saw that you put it in the packet, I noted it, and sort of we've got, we've been talking about monitoring and that kind of thing. So that seems like, again, this is something that's helpful. Later on, we've got something on the agenda on the ISB. I'm wondering, is there, as these hearings go on, is our science program considered an expert resource or for testimony at these hearings? Not getting out in front of it, but just, that's what you guys do. And this seems, again, it's something that moves our ball forward. So is there, is that something, Mr. Chair, that we should be involved in and offer up our experts as the committees hear this? And
I think Dr. Callaway is scheduled to present at the State Water Resources Control Board in the near future.
Yes, Michael George has arranged that, so towards the end of the month of March.
so maybe, as these legislative committees hear these bills, I think that we have something to add, you have something to add to the discussion. So hopefully, so that was just something I wanted to ask about. And then finally, let's put our new planning division head on the spot. SB 1035 looks at general plan requirements, and it seems that, enhancing the flood hazard section of general plans, that type of thing, sorts of fits with the DLIS. And again, is this an opportunity to sort of get in some of the prioritization, some of the things that we think are important in terms of getting them in general plans? Because I think what I'm seeing is there's a need for a stronger linkage between kind of, Delta plan and general land use jurisdictions and their planning. So this would I'd request that staff kind of look at this and see if, hey, is there an opportunity here? So those were my questions. Thank you.
That's great. Ryan, is it too early to tell if there's any funded opposition to either one of the potential water bonds?
I would say there hasn't been any organized opposition that I'm aware of at this point. But certainly, November's still a little bit a ways away. I think, obviously, the current conditions that we're seeing and from a lack of rain will certainly potentially have an influence on voters when they go to the ballot in November, presuming that the trend that we're currently seeing continues. But also sharing the ballot with the Parks bond is certainly something that, as you may recall, the Parks bond does have a water element as well. And so I think it's going to certainly be incumbent upon the proponents of both to be able to delineate between the benefits that each are focused on and would offer.
Okay.
But yeah, at this point, nothing organized that I'm aware of.
All right. Good. Anything else for Ryan? All right. Thank you.
All right. Unless there's any other questions, that concludes the executive officer's report.
Okay. File item number 7. Any requests for comment? Then on to file item number 8, the lead scientist report, Dr. John Callaway.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, council members. So I have a number of items to talk about this morning, a couple papers, the Lobo review, and some announcements. So I'll dive in and try and get through the papers relatively quickly, but happy to answer your questions on them. So the first one is the first paper to review came out in San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science in December. The title is Evaluating the Aquatic Habitat Potential of Flooded Polders in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The author is John Durand, who actually will be here next month. From UC Davis. He's the lead author on the drought synthesis report that the science program has supported. So John has done a long history of work in the Delta. Actually, we were graduate students together at San Francisco State about 30 years ago. And so John, for this paper, he was looking at the islands in the Delta. If the levees are to fail, what kind of aquatic habitat different islands might provide. And so he's looking at it in a different way. So you all are aware of the challenges of maintaining the levees within the Delta and the DLIS effort to come up with a strategic approach to evaluate the levees across the Delta. John took a different approach to say, if the levees fail, what is the actual benefit that different islands might provide? And so he looked at 3 characteristics of the islands: their elevation relative to sea level, what the flow is around the island, and what the turbidity is around the island. And he, from basic fish biology and ecology, he identified that shallower islands that are at slightly higher elevations would provide better habitat. Areas with higher flow are also likely to provide better habitat, and areas with higher turbidity are likely to provide better habitat. So he used those and ranked all of the islands around the Delta. What he showed, based on those assumptions, he showed that The western delta at the confluence of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin is high-value habitat as sort of brackish estuarine habitat. Areas around Cache and Lindsay Slough are high-value backwater sort of habitat. And then farther north in the delta, east of the Yolo bypass, would be habitat that would provide a lot of benefit in terms of sort of tidal river floodplain habitat. The islands that are much lower in elevation, and especially in the South Delta, are more likely to be deep freshwater lakes almost, and don't provide a lot of benefits for native fish, and actually would probably support more non-native fish. So those were some of the conclusions he identified. I think the value, it's a preliminary analysis and a relatively simple analysis, but it does help to prioritize the benefits of those different islands if they were to flood, and I think it could be a useful addition to the decision-making and the strategy around DLIS to incorporate not just their current values, but what their future values might be if they were to flood. So, any questions on that paper?
Just a comment, I think it's wonderful that we're talking about if the levees fail, but we've also heard the other side of that, why the levees are important and why we need to maintain them. Because subsidence occurs naturally, but we need not exacerbate the problem by not addressing the levy issue. And I know we've had a spirited discussion here at this council about whether or not we should maintain the subvention in its current form, or should we look at, as this council has taken a position, to increase that deductible amount per mile on the levies. But again, I have to remind this council and the audience that the levies play an important role, and we ought to make a priority of maintaining the levees and not thinking about, well, if and when they break, how it benefits the environment. Because I think the other side is more devastating to the Delta than having, and I thought that was an interesting description, a poddle.
A polder. Yeah, so a polder, I should have mentioned, I forgot to mention, a polder is a Dutch term.
Yes.
And I'm sure you all know the
Anyway,
Dutch.
those are
The
my
Dutch
comments.
have probably the longest history of anyone in trying to manage low elevation lands. And so their term for a protected area behind a levee is a polder. And that John and others have used that term as well.
That caught my attention.
Yeah.
As I read the article.
Yeah.
Things came to my thoughts. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. I would like very much to see a map and how this overlays with the current DLIS information.
Sure.
I know it's preliminary, but it would be terrific to get a sense of the locations. And in terms of what Skip said, I agree the levees are extremely important. The economic benefit is substantial. I think it would be helpful for folks to think about things in terms of the 50-year planning horizon and climate change and our current water flood management system. And also to remember that DLIS provides a decision support tool, and it really is up to us how the factors are weighed in making that decision. So the tool is not going to make the decision for us. But I think you're right. This kind of study is important for an informed decision.
Great, and there are maps in the paper, so I'd be happy, I'll provide you with a copy of the paper, and if you'd like to talk about them or discuss them in more detail, I'd be happy to.
If I may, Mr. Chair, Susan has a good point to match up the polders and the D-list, because we could see a situation where our priority on the D-list has made one of the levees that surrounds one of the most beneficial polders in conflict. So what, do we maintain that levee, or is the polder more important? So excellent suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I agree also. You got me thinking here about how do they line up, because we had, certain criteria that were weighted in the prioritization. And if there is a crossover, high priority island versus restoration, high restoration potential, and we're protecting it, then, and it seems like, I don't know if Ron's out there, but it seems like this bangs right up into the ecosystem restoration amendment. And we're kind of, a lot of different things converging. So great points.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the decision support tool in the database that as a part of that took into account the 6 high-priority restoration areas that are identified in the Delta Plan. And Cache Slough comes to mind as an area where there is a desire to increase the water-land connection in that region, as well as we'll hear soon from the folks that are working on the Paradise Cut region. It's another area where there is a desire to increase the land-water connection in that area, and that's in keeping with the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. They also have recommended purchasing property for inundation and so on. So it's not so much anticipating levee failures as it is to manage inundation and tidal wetlands and improving habitat connections. So, Cache Slough is on the leading edge of that effort.
I noticed Cache Slough, Susu Marsh, and Yola Bypass, of course, so piqued my interest.
Okay, John?
Great. Okay. Glad there's lots
discussion.
of interest in that. And as I said, I'd be happy to provide the paper or talk about it in more detail.
Yeah, provide that to all the council members,
Okay.
please.
The second paper is entitled Dry and Wet Periods Drive Rapid Shifts in Community Assembly in an Estuarine Ecosystem. It's by Andy Chang and a number of his co-authors. Andy is notably a former Delta Science Fellow, 2009 Delta Science Fellow, and actually this paper includes work that was started while he was a fellow and then has continued more recently. He's now at the Smithsonian Institute working in San Francisco Bay primarily on invasive species issues. So really the main point of his paper was he did this work in San Francisco Bay in the Richmond Marina, and what he looked at was the community of invertebrates that live on the docks or on the edge of hard areas in the marina over a 13-year period, and he followed how the community changes with different inflows. And what he found, that probably isn't so surprising, but I think the surprising thing he found was that there was a very abrupt change in the community depending on flow. And really it was the winter flow and the winter salinities that determined what the invertebrate community would be. And so these are small little animals that attach. Barnacles or little sea squirts that attach onto anything that is a boat or anything that's hard in the water. And they're relatively short-lived, so they do turn over relatively quickly. What he found was if there's a really wet year, the community that's there isn't completely wiped out by the low salinity, and a new community establishes. So he looked at wet years, dry years, or sort of moderate years, and found under each condition a completely different assemblage of species. And so what he wanted to highlight was that these extreme conditions of very high flows or drought conditions were likely to be moving into a period where those are going to become more common, and there could be these dramatic shifts and changes. This, again, was in San Francisco Bay, not in the Delta, but it really, again, links the importance of flow and salinity to the biological community that's out there and how sensitive the community is to these shifts in flow. So any questions on that paper?
Mr. Comment. I think he states the obvious, as we've been wrestling with trying to figure out what is best for the Delta. And these extreme droughts and rain periods for me as a citizen of California to watch opportunities be missed when we're fighting over, enlarging Shasta or Los Vaqueros or Sites Reservoir. Each year that passes, our population gets larger, our agricultural demands increase, but yet we're not taking advantage, or at least not starting on a Sites Reservoir sort of effort. And so I guess, those of us that feel our obligation as a council or as an elected official is trying to look at what is best for the Delta and how we maintain the Delta. We'll never create it as it was in early history, but we have a responsibility to try to maintain what we have. And so if we're talking about flows, I would think, and I'm not a scientist, I just try to logically figure out how do we maintain flows in a period of low rain and low flows. Well, I would think that if you had some sort of reservoir that you could release water that would try to imitate nature, that would assist in the flows and address some of the issues that we're having to struggle with. And so I guess I'm just on my soapbox trying to say to all of us involved in this is we ought to be pushing for Los Vaqueros, Shasta Dam, Sites Reservoir, and figure out if those are going to fit what we need in the state, which is ever demanding more water for urban or agricultural use. So it just a thought when I keep hearing these reports that say because of climate change, we're going to experience these extremes, heavier winters when it does rain, but certainly drier years as well. So a thought.
Great. Okay, that actually leads right into the next item, which is a summary of the panel review of the LOBO project. And LOBO stands for the Long-Term Operations of Biological Opinions related to water operations. And this is, I think, this was, I think, the 7th or 8th LOBO review. It is, for the first time, it's been an annual review in previous years, and in 2015 was proposed that it go to a review every 2 years so that there's more time to evaluate the recommendations and incorporate them into management. So the 2017 review that took place in December, the report from that came out just last month in January, and I'll just summarize some of the recommendations from them. So they looked at 4 issues, so starting first with the Stanislaus River. They looked at the Stanislaus Operation Group and how they're managing flows on the Stanislaus River. What they found, I think one of their main recommendations was that they're trying to use flows, use pulses of flows to support salmon, to improve survivorship of young, and importantly, to promote migration. And the panel felt that was a wise use of the flows and a good approach, but they felt that there needs to be some better evaluation of the characteristics of the flow. So just as we've talked about in sort of many other reports, how big of a peak, how long of a flow, and the panel felt that there's definitely evidence of a relationship, but there should be some more experimentation done to look at a finer-tuned connection between flows and especially migration. They also highlight there and throughout the report of the importance of climate variability and the challenge of managing systems into the future where we will have more extreme events, and that in addition to thinking about operations on an immediate scale, that we should really start to think about a longer term plan of what, on a more of decade scale, how we are going to manage not just the Stanislaus, but other systems. The second component they looked at was the Enhanced Delta Smelt Monitoring Program that is about a year old, where there's a much more intensive effort to collect data on Delta smelt throughout the Delta and to come up with estimates of population size. They felt that that effort is well thought out, that the statistical design and the sampling is very thoughtful. They had a number of specific recommendations about how to fine tune that, how to improve the sampling. They noticed, as many people have, that there's large variation in the population estimates from sampling period to sampling period, in part because the population is so low, so catching a small number of fish has a big effect, and mostly they're catching no fish. But so they had a number of recommendations about sampling design, about analysis, and how they might improve the way that data collection and estimates of population size are done. The third issue that they looked at was the Old and Middle River Index, where there's been a proposal. Currently, the Old and Middle River Index, the flows on the Old and Middle River are used to make decisions about water pumping in the South Delta. And it's based on 2 USGS gauges there. We heard about gauges just a second ago, but so these 2 gauges are used. The challenge is that it's not just flow down a river, it's flow with the tides. And so they have to analyze the data, and you can't make immediate decisions based on the flow, because the flow is so highly variable on a short-term basis. It was proposed that they use a simpler way to evaluate that flow so that they could make more quick decisions. In this case, the panel, I think their sharpest concerns were around this, and they felt that the newly proposed index really doesn't reflect the conditions on the Old and Middle River, because it doesn't incorporate a lot of the tidal flows, and that they shouldn't be using this newly proposed index unless they really more carefully link it to the actual current index that is used. So that was one of their specific, more critical recommendations. And then the last issue they looked at was proposed changes to the Shasta RPA, mostly focusing on water temperature issues and salmon survivorship. And there's been a proposed change again in where and how the data that are collected around water temperature are used in making decisions. In this case, they felt that there was actually stronger justification for the proposed changes. They did have some specific inputs about how to modify the current proposal, but in this case, they felt like there was some good justification for those proposed changes. And then the last thing I'll mention, throughout the report, what they really tried to highlight was the need to connect the measurement and the evaluation of these physical parameters, salinity, flow, or other characteristics, to biological outcomes. Because if we're trying to protect the fish, we really want to be sure that there is that strong linkage. And actually, they they point out that there has been a strong move towards improving those linkages throughout the last decade, but that there still are opportunities for improvement. So, questions on the Lobo review?
John, 2 years ago, we had a panel that described the results of that Lobo review, and it was unclear to me how binding the findings were on decision makers. And our theme of data collection to decisions, where does this report fall?
They're recommendations, so they're not completely binding, but they're definitely highly regarded. So just last week, I got an email from Dave Mooney thanking us for the review and thanking us for the input that they plan to incorporate into their decision making. So I think they definitely carry some weight, but they don't have any specific binding.
But it will precipitate some changes to operations based on lessons learned.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
I think it might, well, I don't know, it might be useful to get the Bureau or the Fish and Wildlife Service to come in and talk about how these have been incorporated into their management efforts.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Anyone else? No?
Okay, so the last few items I'll go through. We've had a series of brown bag seminars. Actually, you'll be hearing from Steve Brannon, the chair of the Delta Independent Science Board, in just a minute. And the Science Board has been supporting review of monitoring within the Delta. And you heard from Steve Culberson last month about the IEP monitoring. As a part of their monitoring review, they are supporting a series of seminars, brown bag seminars, that the science program is hosting to look at a range of monitoring issues. And so most recently, in addition to Steve actually presented as a part of that, and in addition to that, Karen Larson, the deputy director at the State Water Resources Control Board, presented on water quality monitoring. She really highlighted the efforts that the California Water Quality Monitoring Council has been taking to synthesize the data, make the data that's collected on water quality more available through the web so that it's available real time, not just for decision making, but for anyone that is interested in looking at that data. And so the water quality, the council has developed a series of web portals around different water quality issues. She presented most specifically about the estuaries or estuarine monitoring work group and how their data that is collected in part by the IEP around water quality, not around fish, but is made available and used across different agencies. She highlighted some of the challenges that they have in terms of dedicated funding, the need to keep that website up to date and keep the data coming in a reasonable way. But overall, I think her information was well received by the ISB and useful for their evaluation of monitoring. And actually, her presentation also was followed by a panel of a number of other agency staff talking about how they're contributing to water quality monitoring within the Delta. And then I also want to highlight and mention, in addition to the Independent Science Board, I think you know we have a local science advisory committee of about 10 or 12 local scientists who are engaged on issues in the Delta and give input to the science program on issues like the Science Action Agenda or the update to the science plan that we're working on. We have 3 new members, and I just want to mention the 3 new members that we have. So Nusha Ajami is a senior research associate at Stanford. She works on water policy issues. She's actually a hydrologist who works not just on physical issues, but on water policy, and she was the author of the paper that I talked about last month about the effect of media coverage on water use. And in addition to Nusha Ajami, Mark Lubell is joining the committee. Mark is a professor at UC Davis. He works on science governance and on public policy issues, on both water issues and a wide range of other issues, agricultural issues. We asked both of those 2 members to join the Science Advisory Committee so that we would have more social science participation and more advice from the social science side, because mostly we have natural scientists on that advisory committee. And then in addition to Nusha and Mark, Tamara Kraus at USGS is a water quality specialist, and our former water quality advisor, Val Connor, had to step down. And so Tamara, who's done an enormous amount of work within the Delta on a wide range of nutrient and carbon issues, will be giving us advice on those issues. And then last is just an announcement of the upcoming workshop that we're hosting with UC Davis on salmon disease. And that will be March 14th. It's a 1-day workshop looking at the effect of pathogens and disease on salmon populations and trying to understand how to manage disease issues within those populations. And again, it'll be an all-day seminar. And as with all of our workshops, it's a mix of science and management issues. So I'll give you an update sometime in the next couple months after that workshop is completed. Any questions? Okay,
No.
so we'll now hear by the numbers. And as you know, Catherine has moved on to Sea Grant in San Diego, near Oxenberg, who is the staff member at the science program who works on communications issues, is going to present by the numbers for the next few months until our new Sea Grant fellow who's working on communications will join us. So Nir.
Good morning, Mr. Chair.
Good morning, Mayor.
Mr. Chair and council members. I'm happy to be here this morning to present some take-home messages from the numbers. I'll dive right in. As you know, it has been a dry February and altogether a very dry water year. We are currently at lower levels of rain than at this time during the 2015 drought. Snowpack is also extremely low. Statewide, we are currently at just 20% of average snow cover for this time of year. If this snow pattern continues, it will mean that the lowest 3 snowpacks in historical record will have happened in the last 5 years. The good news is that there's some rain in the forecast and also some snow forecasted in the Sierras. Bad news is I forgot my umbrella today. Even though we have had extremely low precipitation this year, reservoir storage remains average, mostly because of how wet it was last year. Of course, there is the exception of Orville and the ongoing construction. With regards to water quality and flow, the take-home message is that there are slight drops in flow from last month and no major changes in salinity. I'm going to move on to the fish. There are an estimated 458,320 juvenile winter red Chinook salmon at Red Bluff, and this is about a quarter of the 15-year average. The spring Kodiak trawl caught 14 Delta smelt. This is almost 5% of the 17-year average and just over half of what was found at this time last year. In addition to the regular numbers we present, I also want to briefly mention a couple of invaders that were observed due to monitoring efforts. This is a good reminder that it is important to perform regular monitoring so we can identify these invaders early and increase our ability to respond. So, nutria. What is a nutria? A nutria is an aquatic rodent. They grow up to be about 2.5 feet long with an extra foot length and tail, and they weigh about 20 pounds. You could kind of imagine them to be the size of a beagle. They are native of South America, and they were originally introduced into the U.S. for fur trade. And then they made their way over to California, and they were thought to be eradicated from California in the 1960s. However, a new population of over 20 nutria were recently identified in the San Joaquin Valley in the Merced, Fresno, and Stanislaus counties. So why are nutria a problem? Well, they decimate vegetation. They also eat the roots, which means that the vegetation doesn't really grow back, and it transforms the landscape from plants to essentially open water. They're also wasteful feeders, and they destroy up to 10 times the amount of vegetation that they actually eat. And furthermore, they burrow into levees and weaken them, which can be a serious problem. Finally, they reproduce really fast. They reach reproductive maturity at just 6 months and have multiple litters a year. That means that one female can result in a family tree of over 200 nutria in just 1 year. So, what do you do if you see a nutria or some signs from a nutria? Well, first thing you do is you take a picture, and then you report it to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Invasive Species Program online or by phone. Now, in Louisiana, they have a different approach, or an additional approach. In Louisiana, these are also a big issue. They also, they have similar wetland marshes and levees, and hunters are encouraged to kill nutria and then even eat them. As a matter of fact, senior environmental scientist Yumiko Henneberry here at the Delta Science Program has expressed interest in cooking and eating a nutria. So if anybody has access to a nutria, please let Yumiko know.
Mr. Chair, I will note actually that in South America, the Pope issued an official bull that Catholics could eat nutria on Fridays, and they count as fish. They count as fish because they are aquatic. So to all my compatriots, there is your solution to the problem.
That's a fun fact. Thank you. The other invader I wanted to really briefly mention was the bluefin killifish. In October of last year, about 20 suspected bluefins were collected during sampling near the Delta Cross channels. They were genetically analyzed at UC Davis and confirmed to be the bluefin killifish. These fish are native of Southeast United States, but are really common in the aquarium trade. At this point, it is unknown if these fish will continue to grow in numbers or what effect they may have on the Delta ecosystem. That concludes my report. Thank you.
All right, Nir, thanks. Very entertaining. Any questions, Ken?
Just looking at the winter run numbers, if the 15-year average is just over 2 million, and we're at under 500,000 at Red Bluff, what do we think is going on?
I think it's partly in large part reflective of past populations. So since the population had declined so much during the drought, it will take time to recover, even with wet years. So it's both a function of current conditions as well as past populations.
So then, if we're in one of these patterns where we get one wet year and then we start going dry again, that's just, accumulation of stressors on that population.
Exactly. So we need we'd need a series of good years, multiple good years in a row for the population to grow and to recover.
Or the management
yeah.
of upstream reservoirs.
Yeah.
Haven't they recently found spawners and tributaries?
Yes.
Beyond the main stem?
Yeah, so that is
was surprising.
good news that was recently, I don't know if it was published in a paper or if it was just a report, but there have been winter run that have been found in other locations where they haven't been thought, not just found, but spawning. Mm-hmm. And so that's a good indication that, there's some hope that the population could start to do better in a mix of locations.
Is that a modification of their behavior to go up those tributaries?
It is, but, they're relatively flexible.
Adaptive.
Yes.
That's how they became winter run.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, anything else?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to follow the comedians here on this council. But following up on Ken's question about the winter run, if you notice with the Delta smell that talks about numbers at this time last year, it would be helpful to look at the numbers. Where does this 458,000 compare to last year? It only gives a 15-year average.
I'm not certain, but we have.
I have
we
those
did
numbers.
have the. Do you have them right there?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
So at this time, I have the February 2017 by the numbers report in front of me, and at this time last year, there were 523,162 estimated winter run Chinook salmon. And this year, we are at 458,000.
Okay. I mean, that gives it a little more perspective to look year to year. Okay, thanks.
All right. John?
That concludes my report.
Great, thank you. Any requests for comment? Amanda? Okay, that concludes file item number 8. What I'm going to do is we'll proceed on now to file item 9, the ecosystem amendment update. Following that, we'll take about a 10-minute break before we launch into the Paradise Cut discussion. So for those of you that are planning your snack break, we'll get to that in about a half an hour. So Jessica, you want to make some comments about the ecosystem amendment update?
All right, council members, as you know, for the past few months, I've been providing updates on progress on the ecosystem amendment. We've had binders in the memo, and we've been promising you a live presentation. So Ron Melser, supervising scientist, environmental scientist at the council, will provide an update on that. Ron is the lead on the ecosystem amendment, and I'll let him take it from here.
Council members, Chair Fiorini, good morning. So I prepared some remarks this morning. I'd like to give you an update on some of the preliminary work that we've been undertaking as part of the ecosystem amendment. See if I can queue up my presentation here. Okay, before diving in, I wanted to take a moment to recognize key staff within the planning division at the council who have really been engaged in the nuts and bolts of putting this body of work together. So Kate Anderson, Megan Brooks, Lita Bridey, Dan Constable, Corey Copeland, an interdisciplinary team of folks that's really been engaged, and they're the experts in this body of information. I'll attempt to present and give an overview on the papers today and some of the other work that we're doing. I would also be remiss if I didn't recognize the council support staff, so especially Caprice Schular and Leslie Carey. They've been instrumental in helping get some agreements together with universities and helping to put some of the technical analyses in place very quickly. So that's been really helpful. And lots of interaction with the science program and just counsel from many people across the agency. So very appreciative of that. I'll start with a bit of background just to kind of frame the synthesis paperwork. I'll discuss the process and scope of the papers and step through a high-level summary which provides many of the considerations resulting from this work for each of the papers. And then I'll finish today's presentation with a discussion of next steps on the amendment process. So, as we all know, the Delta Reform Act of 2009 declared state goals for the Delta, providing a more reliable water supply for California and protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem. The Act also provided key ecological outcomes related to ecosystems, the recovery of and conservation of species and stressor reduction. It provided a set of strategies to achieve these objectives, including a time horizon of 2100 and areas of ecological focus, for example, species, habitat, connectivity, a focus on migration corridors, and issues of water quality. There are more. The Act required that the plan be founded on best available science, that it include quantified or measurable targets, and that it include a science-based, transparent, and formal adaptive management strategy. So stepping forward to 2013, the adoption of the Delta Plan, Chapter 4, the ecosystem-focused chapter was framed around 5 key strategies, which addressed natural functional flows, the restoration of habitat, water quality improvements, prevention and management of non-native species, and improvement of hatcheries and harvest management. These strategies were to be carried out in a manner that protects and enhances the unique cultural, recreational, and agricultural values of the California Delta as an evolving place per Water Code Section 85020 and 85054. As I said in October, when we introduced work on the amendment, the framework for the chapter is solid. It remains relevant. Of course, at that time it was developed. It was developed and structured around the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which would have been a natural community conservation plan under the Department of Fish and Wildlife's approval. The implication here is that an NCCP would have taken a holistic look at the natural resources and biodiversity in the Delta and set forth protection and restoration objectives that supported recovery, not just impact avoidance of specific infrastructure projects. And it would have addressed both listed species and overall ecological protection. So with the state's shift from this approach to one that is focused on specific infrastructure projects and actions to mitigate their construction and operation, this has left a bit of a gap in the comprehensiveness of the chapter. Additionally, and just as importantly, again, as I shared in October, there have been many key developments in multiple arenas. So state initiatives such as B3015 requiring incorporation of climate change in planning, new funding opportunities such as Proposition 1 and refinements in our understanding of the ecological conditions in the Delta, and then also social aspects of restoration in the Delta through both contributions in the science community and other technical papers. So the last piece of context in response to these developments, the council has undertaken, I should change slides here. So pivotal events since 2013, those that I listed. And then the other piece of context is that the council has been undertaking several amendments, one focused on conveyance, storage, and operations, one on the Delta Levy's investment strategy, and one focused on performance measures refinement. So of course, today I'm here to speak to work underneath of the ecosystem amendment umbrella. So at a high level, the amendment process consists of three initial components. Tried to put together a bit of a slide that demonstrates this model. Development of science synthesis papers, technical analyses, and an outreach component, which includes listening sessions by members of the council. I'll step through the synthesis papers in a few minutes. Technical analyses are relatively limited, but we are undertaking some important work, some of which is underway independent of the amendment. For example, the Planning Division of the Council is supporting and working with the BCDC on the implementation of an Adapting to Rising Tides study of the Western Delta. Planning Division has also partnered with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and is supporting the Geographic Information Center at Chico State University in updating the Veg Camp vegetation and land use map of the Delta. This map, originally developed in 2005, underpins most of the ecological analyses that deal with land use and land cover within the region over the past decade, including much of the work the SFEI has undertaken on existing Delta conditions. So this is a really important data set, and it's long overdue for updating. One last analysis that we have in motion is an update to the map that supports ERP2, the policy on appropriate restoration elevations. This work includes reconciling tidal datums and using new sea level rise information for the Delta region. We've also, to build on the discussion about Dr. Duran's paper on flooded polders, we've been engaged with the USGS and are quantitatively analyzing land use projections and areas where strategic subsidence reversal activities may constrain or provide opportunities for restoration, respectively. And that this work leverages the DLIS and the data that comprise that tool. And we're pretty excited. Kate Anderson is a lead author on a presentation where we'll present preliminary findings of this work at the IEP meeting next month. And then we're shooting for a discussion at the Bay Delta Science Conference in the fall. And I think it's some pretty integrated and solid work that really builds on the steps that Dr. Duran put out. And so just have a note here, to Councilmember Thompson's point, I think strategic investments in levees can be viewed as a way to buy time and to apply subsidence halting and subsidence reversal activities strategically and to really support protecting the Delta in the long term and the environmental resources that exist there. So we're excited about this thread of discussion and incorporating that in the amendment. So in summary, all of this work provides the foundation which we will be developing a set of proposed refinements to the policies, recommendations, and performance measures of the chapter. And that's the synth papers, the technical analyses, and the outreach component of the effort. So a brief overview of the process of developing the papers. This is pretty high level, but essentially the council staff that I mentioned early in the presentation have been working closely with contractor support, scientists from Environmental Science Associates, in developing drafts of the synthesis papers. These drafts are being completed somewhat in series, so climate first, and then 2 other papers afterward. We are now in the process of finalizing a peer review with the science program staff and the lead scientist, Dr. Callaway. Next steps include an interagency review by partner agencies working within the Delta and an informal review by the Restoration Subcommittee of the Independent Science Board. We anticipate a full review of the draft amendment and the synthesis papers by the Independent Science Board later in the year during our environmental review process. Of note, we are intending to post the working drafts of the synthesis papers on the council website in mid-March. And at this point, they will have undergone peer review, but not had interagency comments or red flag ISB review comments incorporated. I think our intent is to just get the information out early and start to interact and have discussions around the content of the papers. So I started to mention the papers have focused on 3 key areas: climate change and the Delta region, and that includes implications of sea level rise, Delta ecosystems, both the terrestrial and aquatic components, and implications for the food web, and then overarching approaches for conservation and restoration within the system. Okay, so a little bit difficult to comprehensively unpack each of the papers in this forum. We'd love to have offline discussions if anyone's interested, and then, of course, after you're able to interact directly with the papers, we're excited to have conversations. But I'll step through a few summary stats and some of the overarching findings. Given the Council's engagement in the Delta scientific arena, I think much of what I'll discuss won't really come as a surprise. I think this Council tracks, obviously, scientific bodies of work related to the Delta quite closely. But nonetheless, we'll step through some of the themes and findings. So for the climate change paper, the paper is about 40 pages in length at this point, and at last count has synthesized the findings of approximately 186 peer-reviewed journal articles and technical reports. For climate change effects on rivers, floodplains, and biota, the Delta and its watershed, we expect increases in extreme precipitation and drought. I think we're seeing it. This, of course, will have implications for floodplain inundation, temperature stress, both in the watershed upstream and to a lesser extent within the Delta. Sea level rise has compounding implications, including water quality, habitat distribution, interactions with subsidence, and constraints on restoration opportunities. So considerations for practice and policy. Accommodation space for wetland and riparian ecosystems and restoration planning is important to consider. Changes in the location of ecosystem characters, such as the salinity gradient, will have effects on planning. The need to anticipate shifts in zones suitable for habitat restoration, also a key finding. Coincidentally, Dr. Seavey, who is sitting on the panel discussion following this item, published a paper several years ago with other scientists discussing the importance of riparian and riverine systems in the face of a rapidly changing climate. So some of the modeling tools that we have available to us demonstrate that the Delta is anticipated to be cooler than most of the Central Valley. This, combined with the importance of Dr. Seavey's paper related to connectivity provided by the Delta's network of river channels and the aquatic terrestrial interface of wetland riparian ecosystems, makes the region a really crucial resource for species and their ecological adaptation to, again, the rapidly changing climate. So we're seeing the Delta as somewhat of a climate refuge, an important spot on the map. Climate change, of course, will introduce greater uncertainty, requiring adaptive decision-making and management. And lastly, there are new tools available which allow for a robust understanding of future conditions and how to think about risk aversion planning. Interestingly, these are available online to everyone, and they're relatively easy to access in terms of their technical level. And so it's neat to get around and sort of look at some of the trends and patterns that are projected. Okay, switching gears to the Delta ecosystem. This paper currently reviewed 280 scientific and technical papers and stands at about 70 pages in length. Lots of figures in there, however. Again, not a lot of surprises in the overarching findings. Of note, estuaries in general, are some of the most productive landscapes on the globe in terms of primary productivity, yet the California Delta, including its food web, has been significantly impaired by multiple stressors: flow impairment, loss of floodplain connectivity and geomorphic process, land conversion and loss of vegetation communities and ecosystems, and non-native species. To date, progress on process-based restoration has been limited within the footprint of the Delta. If we look upstream at the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge or the San Joaquin National Wildlife Refuge, we see significant progress in recovery of floodplain reconnection, reestablishment of native vegetation communities. There are several papers that have measured the response of the biota to those restoration actions. The Delta lags behind in actual on-the-ground implementation of these types of actions. And actually, a blog post yesterday released by the PPIC discusses that the sole focus on synthetic actions such as flow augmentation have been problematic in halting declines in the Delta ecosystem. The article discusses the importance of actions on the landscape such as floodplain reconnection and reestablishment of ecosystem components and function. So we're pretty excited to see consistencies between our science synthesis work and some of the findings of independent bodies out there also reviewing science. So considerations stemming from this paper, again, a focus on reestablishment of hydraulic connectivity and geomorphic functions, vegetation communities, so essentially process-based restoration in meeting what the Delta Reform Act lies out as the outcomes desired within the Delta. Novel actions within the Delta, so actions that develop analog habitats, may provide opportunities to augment these approaches where significant constraints such as subsidence exist. We have many examples of these projects on the ground now, so wildlife-friendly agriculture, habitat features on levees, managed wetlands. Enhanced scientific evaluation will help us better understand the benefits of these activities and their potential to support food web recovery and support the varied needs of fish and wildlife species in a more holistic way. So we look forward to learning more about those types of approaches. Another key consideration is the need to shift from natural resource management focused solely on avoiding and mitigating endangered species impacts to development of a broader ecosystem and biodiversity-based set of goals and objectives. This, of course, being analogous to what is undertaken through an NCCP process. So opportunities and constraints vary by subregion. The Delta Landscapes project by SFEI, this is the Historical Transform Renewed series of publications, discusses key aspects of the landscape to consider when thinking about regions of the Delta. This is superficial geology, landform type, geomorphic process potential, specific watershed characteristics, so Sacramento versus San Joaquin versus east side tributaries. These are things that we see through work in the Blue Ribbon Task Force in the early days of prior to the council, and Bay Delta Conservation Plan and in CalFed. So again, not terribly new information, but updated and more refined understanding of it. Lastly, another touch on adaptive management and species population management. There are some pretty sophisticated and new emerging tools, some that leverage environmental DNA, conservation genetics. Employing these would be really useful in the adaptive management framework in understanding how species are interacting with our actions on the landscape. Okay, last paper, and I'll try and wrap up here. This paper is focused on issues of conservation and restoration at a higher level. It attempts to wrap up the findings of the climate and the ecosystem paper. It's a higher level discussion and also touches on the relationship of these actions to society and some of the important considerations associated with social aspects of restoration. So the paper is about 40 pages in length and right now has about 256 peer-reviewed journal articles and technical reports that were synthesized. This paper stands, I already sort of stepped through that. A major consideration here is that achieving the Delta Reform Act will require a comprehensive, multifaceted, and balanced approach, one that leverages integrated planning, consideration of sea level rise, urbanization, and social and environmental risk in restoration planning, one that employs both process-based restoration, protection through reserve design, and balances those approaches with novel actions that we have already employed within the Delta. A key discussion in this paper is that natural resource protection and restoration is not a zero-sum game for other sectors, for agriculture, or for the communities within the Delta. Many peer-reviewed papers discuss the fact that society depends directly on the biological integrity of its landscapes. There are economic benefits, social and environmental risk reduction aspects to the protection and restoration of the ecosystem. Recovery of the environment would benefit some of the most socially and environmentally vulnerable regions of the state. This is demonstrated using the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, CAL, and ViroScreen mapping tools. So another neat way of pulling some social science data into the planning equation. Importantly, collaboration and cooperation are needed in addressing these issues. Madani and Dr. Lund, in 2011, using a game theory framework, demonstrate that it is possible for all actors in the Delta to make economically rational decisions, which ultimately lead to environmental catastrophe. And so we really need to be thoughtful about how to move forward on these issues. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife's conservation framework, the Delta Conservation Framework, provides a forum for this collaboration and cooperation. And lastly, for this paper, a key part of natural resource management is having clear and measurable objectives, which are founded in ecological science. This ensures that the needs of the ecosystem and species are addressed, and that they also serve to align stakeholders, such that we are all talking about the same set of outcomes. Additionally, they provide efficiencies in prioritizing actions in funding-constrained systems. So for each of these papers, there's much more to share, but I think I will leave it there for now, and we can continue discussion in the future. I'll do a quick touch on, am I able to go back to last slide? Quick touch on next steps. So tonight in Cortland, at the Cortland Auditorium from 5 to 7, we'll be holding an open house where lead authors for synthesis papers will be unpacking some of the results in a little more detail and getting into the nuts and bolts a little more with figures and discussion. We will be stepping through the reviews and comment incorporation on the synthesis papers over the next 6 weeks to 2 months. We will continue to work on completing the technical analyses that I described earlier. In parallel, we will be developing a set of proposed refinements to the performance measures, policies, and recommendations of Chapter 4, crosswalking carefully these refinements with the work that I've described. And in May, we'll return to present an informational item on the refinement work on the chapter. Lastly, in June and July, we will be looking to present a draft amendment for review and approval for environmental review to begin. And with that, I will close and take questions. So that's a lot of information. Sorry it's so dense and a bit long, but hopefully that's informative.
Ron, you did an excellent job distilling that down to a very informative report. Questions of Ron?
A couple questions, Mr. Chair.
Skip?
I initially had some questions about the difference between the conservation planning and restoration science and the terrestrial aquatic ecosystems. For the layperson, I was trying to figure out what the difference was. So can I just boil it down to one sentence that you have in your report? It says it's going to look at how to assess species response to restoration. Is that really the goal between the two, or is that too simple?
So to be completely transparent, we also have struggled a little bit with the overlap of all of these papers. Ecological issues are so integrated. I think the simplest way to think about it is that the ecosystem paper, and maybe we need to work on a title change that's more explicit, deals with the actual landscape, the condition, some of the efforts that are underway. It starts to frame the types, like the actual conceptual types of improvements that we need. So whether that's reconnecting a floodplain or specific agricultural practices that may benefit species. So it does tie back to species. The conservation and restoration paper is focused more on how to think about management of the system, how we might approach integrated planning in conducting socially responsible restoration on the landscape that benefits society and engages society, but then also provides benefits for species. So maybe it starts to get at more of the issues of governance and implementation. That's sort of my best
No, that's fine.
take
I mean,
at
there's
trying
always
to-
a saying, you got to know who your audience is. So maybe there is a need to, being transparent, to try to figure out how it best describes the relationship between those two. That's just a suggestion.
The reality is that all the papers are closely related, and they overlap in content by design, essentially. And this series is meant to work together, and then again in informing the proposed refinements to the amendment, and we hope to carefully document the supporting evidence coming out of the papers as that relates to specific changes in the amendment. So,
Thanks, Ron. And one last question, Mr. Chair. Under the Delta Plan, it talks about the preventive introduction of and manage non-native species impacts. And so the question is would there be an opportunity here with AB 2053, the Harmful Algae Bloom Task Force? Would that be some legislation that this council might want to consider supporting? Because we've heard it time and time again, the algae bloom is a real problem, especially in times of low flows or warmer waters. This might be an attempt to deal with that in a larger group of folks, a task force. So we might want to consider supporting that bill at this point. Just a thought.
Anyone else? Ken?
Yeah, really good presentation, Ron, and I'm on the subcommittee that Susan chairs, and I've just been so impressed with the team and just, kind of how committed you guys are, and this, as I said, I think last month, none of this is easy. So really commend you guys for tackling this. I just had a couple of quick questions. On the slide on Delta ecosystem and the bullet, sort of the target recovery of ecological function, shift from endangered species impacts to broader ecosystem targets. So is this sort of, as this plan amendment replaces the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, where you had the co-equal goals in sort of one big NCCP, HCP, are we talking about, and what I'm getting at is the linkage back to water supply reliability as a co-equal goal, and, the end of the day, we'll put a plan amendment out that says, gee, you need to do this amount of acreage, and this is where it should go. It's all going to come down to, oh, where's the money coming from? And so, it seems like our obligation or our mission is to achieve the co-equal goals. So I wouldn't want to be too broad in what our ecosystem targets are, because eventually this is going to have to get prioritized, and we need to maintain that linkage to water supply reliability. So I have some concern about just the broadness in the statement of shifting from endangered species impacts to broader ecosystem targets without explaining how that, because it was so specific in the BDCP about all the tidal wetlands and how that would, restore populations, and that would allow, them to kind of ratchet back on outflow. So that's just one comment as you put together this, and I think you guys have really gotten your arms around some key issues and tough issues. So on the J. Lund and Madani paper, where you said rational economic decisions could result in catastrophe, I'm guessing that's rational economic decisions based on self-interest. But I haven't read the paper, so maybe this is something, that would be helpful to council members for us to kind of see that.
Great, we can share.
Yeah, I'm just guessing that it's economic self-interest only is
Implied by rational.
Yeah, and it is rational to act in your self-interest, but it may not be the right decision. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Any requests for public comment? Then, Ron, thank you very much. You are leading a very, very hardworking team that's developing a very impressive list of data, and we look forward to receiving the synthesis papers and ultimately the recommendations and performance measures in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a 5-minute break at this time, and our goal is to work through, I said 10, but we're running a little late. Our goal is to work through to the end of the meeting, and then we'll ultimately break for lunch. So we're in recess for about 5 minutes. So we are going to resume our agenda and pick up at file item number 10, the Paradise Cut implementation. As you'll recall, one of the high priority restoration areas identified in the Delta Plan is the Paradise Cut restoration area. It took a lot of interest was attended to that area after the 1997 floods that inundated Mossdale and the areas around that area. And a lot of work has been underway for a number of years. And today we're going to hear an update on some of the progress and some of the challenges. And I look to Ron Meltzer to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Good morning again. Okay, so as stated, we'll be discussing the Paradise Cut and a flood risk reduction and multi-benefit project in the region. Before we dive into the details of today's discussion, I just wanted to take a minute and introduce panel members. So to the far left, I guess it would be your right, is Charlotte Mitchell, Executive Director of the Central Valley Farmland Trust. Ms. Mitchell will cover what role the Farmland Trust has in protecting agricultural lands through agricultural conservation easements. And of course, this will be discussed in the context of Paradise Cut. Sitting next to her is John Kane, Director of Conservation for California Flood Management with American Rivers. Mr. Kane will provide a non-governmental organization perspective on this multi-benefit project, specifically as it relates to achieving flood benefits along with long-term habitat restoration measures. And last, Nat Seavey, Research Director for the Pacific Coast and Central Valley Group, Point Blue Conservation Science. Dr. Seavey will speak to some of the challenges of permanently conserving landscapes in a system that is changing due to climate change, sea level rise, and other stressors, and new ideas about making conservation programs more responsive to changing conditions. So I'll step through a couple slides in the presentation, and then I want to touch on a couple of the key questions for consideration that are in the staff report. So today's presentation is titled Easements, a tool for preserving resources we value, or a straitjacket that will limit our ability to adapt to a changing world. A case study from Paradise Cut. And the purpose of today's discussion, there are several objectives. One, provide an update on Paradise Cut, the bypass expansion work. Utilize Paradise Cut as a case study to illustrate the limitations and problems surrounding easements. So with Paradise Cut, we have a project with multiple benefits that's largely supported, has funding behind it, and we think this is an important opportunity to discuss. Even in this supported project, there are challenges out there that are impeding progress in moving forward. So these are coming up in the context of a project that, again, should be able to move forward. This isn't even the difficult parts of the landscape where we don't have alignment on what to do. So key discussion. And last, I'd like to discuss and potentially identify more dynamic approaches for protecting resources in a changing world. So specifically, challenges have centered on conflicts between different types of easements. The primary types that we're concerned with in Paradise Cut, a flood easement, and of course this restricts encroachments and is meant to preserve the ability to convey water down the floodway and preserve access for flood fighting activities during flood events and inspections of facilities during non-flood events. So a really important easement in the context of environmental risk reduction for our communities. The second easement is an agricultural conservation easement. We all well know that market forces dictate cropping patterns and the preferences of agricultural practices on the landscape. Easements that address agriculture are written in a way that attempts to protect that space for the agricultural sector to continue to farm and to apply practices and crops that align with the market. Hopefully I'm characterizing that correctly. The last is a habitat easement. And this last easement, depending on the specific objectives and the context in which it's applied, sometimes it's a conservation approach, sometimes it's associated with offsetting impacts from projects, so in a mitigation sense. It's really intended to establish and preserve ecological objectives on the landscape. And in some cases, for certain species that have adapted to agricultural practices, this can coexist with agriculture. For other situations, it may actually conflict with agriculture, agricultural conservation easements. Flood easements oftentimes put limits on the types of vegetation communities that can grow in the floodway, and that, of course, can conflict directly with both of the other easements. So it's complicated, and it's something that we're bumping up against in Paradise Cut, of course. And so in thinking about these different types of easements and the case study, as we step through the presentation, there are a few key questions for consideration. So one, what other tools beyond easements are available to achieve the desired outcomes of flood risk reduction and increased ecological value while protecting existing land uses? Two, how can we maintain agricultural sustainability while also encouraging multi-benefit projects within the Delta? And given that the Delta is not a static system and drivers such as climate change will change the status quo, how can future amendments to the Delta Plan provide an opportunity for addressing these challenges? And so with that, I'll turn it over to the panel to step through meeting or discussion objectives.
Thanks for having us. Okay, thanks for having us again to hear about Paradise Cut. I wanted to just do a quick overview of Paradise Cut. Some of you may not be as familiar as others with it, even though it's part of the Delta Plan. The key, this map shows a map from the Delta Plan, and it shows the red arrow where floodwaters normally go down the San Joaquin, and the blue arrow is where the Paradise Cut bypass would be expanded to convey floodwaters out of the urbanizing corridor between Manteca, Lathrop, and Stockton and into the primary zone of the Delta. And it not only reroutes and redirects floodwaters away from high-risk urban areas like the Yolo bypass does, it also expands the total flood-carrying capacity of the lower San Joaquin River, which has benefits that I'll get to in a moment. The flood plan, which I was presented to you on the past about with Mike Mearswood of DWR, really emphasizes the idea of multi-benefit flood management projects, and this is yet another multi-benefit flood risk reduction project. It not only reduces flood risk, it expands the capacity of the system, which reduces long-term conflict between ecosystem restoration management and flood management. It is important for the long-term plan to increase flexibility for reservoir management with water supply benefits that could be associated with that. It would help protect and conserve agricultural land, both in the expanded footprint area and outside of the expanded footprint area, provide major habitat benefits for species like riparian brush rabbit and Swainson's hawk, and ultimately increase the area of floodplain habitat for fish like salmon. It's been identified in state plans and legislation for several years now. I won't go through the details here. There is this quote here that you can look at later. This was on the right-hand side of the screen. David Kennedy, the director of DWR after the '97 flood, got the book Battling the Inland Sea reprinted, and he wrote the foreword of the book. And he said, it's about time we do a flood bypass on the San Joaquin because it worked so well. The flood bypass system works so well on the Sacramento River. And at the end of his description of this, he wrote, it is hoped that these issues will be resolved and changes will be made before the next flood. It's interesting how he was a very effective government bureaucrat, but he used the passive voice here. It is hoped. I hope that we can expedite this, and we keep running into problems and trying to get this implemented. And SB 5 was passed, I think, in 2007, and it talked about studying this. The 2012 plan of the flood plan included Paradise Cut. The Delta plan included Paradise Cut. The 2017 plan included Paradise Cut. We're making some progress, but as you'll see, we've got a long way to go, and we're going to need more than the passive voice to get this done. This is just some text from the Delta plan regarding Paradise Cut, and I just want to point out that the Delta plan references a map from a proposal, and that map's the map on top, colored in red, and the map on the bottom is the 2017 flood plan map. It's the map of Paradise Cut project in the 2017 flood plan. And you can see from the shape that this project really hasn't changed significantly since it was adopted as part of the flood plan in terms of its footprint. There's been a lot of analysis on it, but it's still the same thing. This is a more detailed map. This was actually developed by an initiative that the Delta Conservancy convened called the Delta Dialogues process. The Delta Stewardship Council had staff that were involved in this. We ultimately ended up working with locals as part of the Delta Dialogues process to identify a solution and a footprint that would really work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But what you're looking at here is in green is the existing, I guess it doesn't help for me to point the the laser. I won't point it at you. In green is the existing Paradise Cut. It's a very small distributary channel and flood conveyance channel of the San Joaquin. And the yellow or beige color on there is where we're proposing to expand Paradise Cut. And in the lower right-hand corner, we're proposing putting in a new weir that would be approximately 1,000 feet long at ground surface elevation, and floodwaters would flow into this expanded area, kind of like a forebay, attenuating the peak flows, and then it would flow down the existing Paradise Cut. And the benefits are that this design, as modeled by the Department of Water Resources, and it's been the subject of about 10 modeling studies, all of which have been fairly consistent, that it would lower flood stage for the 200-year flood by over 2.5 feet, and that's a really big deal in flood management. It would lower the flood stage along 30 miles of river, all the way from the Port of Stockton to the confluence of the Stanislaus, and probably going up the Stanislaus River a little bit as well. And it would significantly reduce flood risk for the 30,000 residents that already live on Reclamation District 17, as well as approximately 10,000 acres of farmland upstream and downstream of Highway 5 along the San Joaquin River. I had to show you some modeling output. The blue line shows how much the flood stage is reduced along the river. On the right-hand side is the line is starting at the Stanislaus River, and you can see the stage drops by over 2 feet for long reaches, and then on the far left side is the Port of Stockton, or the ship channel. And near Highway 5 and the railroad tracks, which is the really high-risk area for the levees to break and flood urban areas, we're lowering the flood stage by about 2.25 feet. But it's also at the Banta Carbona Canal, if you know where that is. That's where you maximize the flood stage reduction, and that will have very significant benefits for the agricultural landowners on both sides of the levied San Joaquin and that reach. So this graph here is really the very key graph, and I won't try to explain it to you with my laser pointer because it doesn't work so well. The take-home point here, and I think this is the point that allowed the locals to say we can support a project like this, was that the expanded bypass area would only get inundated once every 12 years. So the existing agricultural use out on the property is field crops, mostly alfalfa, and that would be able to continue largely unchanged with this new flood bypass. By contrast, the Yolo bypass floods at least every 3 years and probably every 2 out of 3 years, and there's quite productive agriculture there. Here it would be once every 12 years. So the project status, as I said, it's included it's not just included in the 2017 flood plan, it's included as one of 3 keystone projects in the flood plan. American Rivers and the San Joaquin RCD are implementing a $200,000 planning study that we got a grant from the Delta Conservancy to implement, to refine the plan. Meanwhile, DWR is moving to conduct more detailed engineering design. There's a typo here, but we have $4 million in grants to purchase flood and habitat easements. And American Rivers is currently negotiating with the landowners to purchase flood and easement acquisition on the 2,000 acres necessary. The legislature appropriated $20 million last year of Proposition 1 funds for what they call system-wide projects in the Delta. And some of that money could be used and was identified to be used for Paradise Cut, at least in an earlier I can't remember if it was the Department of Finance. We think we need $15 million. We already have 4. There's enough state funding to do all of the easement acquisition when you combine it with the $4 million we have. We've contacted all of the landowners in the acquisition area, and we've gotten appraisals on 3 properties that constitute 70% of the bypass expansion area. And the easement acquisition effort is really stuck on this one key parcel where there's an agricultural conservation easement already on the property. And this existing easement, which is held by the Central Valley Farmland Trust, prohibits new flood and habitat easements. And this language here is pretty standard in agricultural conservation easements, something that I've learned. And it says the grant of any easements or other interests in land or use restrictions that might diminish or impair the agricultural productive capacity or open space character of the property is prohibited. And we've had arguments that, well, this won't really impair the capacity because the land's being used for its highest use. But the second bullet point is really the tough one. The grantor may grant subsequent conservation easements. So it says, they could do it, or restrictions on the property, provided that such easements or use restrictions do not significantly restrict agricultural husbandry practices. In other words, they don't restrict the kind of crops you can grow out there. And the easement that we currently have written and currently have funds for is a habitat easement that restricts vines and orchards. And for a flood easement, you would normally want to restrict vines and orchards. But the Feather River floodway has orchards in it, so it's not unheard of to have orchards in a floodway, but it's not particularly good flood policy. So we worked with go ahead.
Quick
Yes.
question, not to be too ticky-tacky or the lawyer, but doesn't husbandry mean rearing of animals? It doesn't mean growing crops.
It does include growing crops. I think the ... it goes on to say animal husbandry, crop growing,
okay.
all areas of agricultural production.
Interesting, okay.
It's the first thing I thought when I read that as well. So American Rivers has been working with the Central Valley Farmland Trust. Charlotte has been really given a lot of time to this. I feel bad for dragging her into this, but it's her job. And so we've been trying to figure out, okay, what do we do about this conflict? We convened an expert panel, and we gave them several questions, and they came back and answered them. I can go into more detail on that. But the long and the short is they said, yeah, you have a conflict, and there are not a lot of good legal options here for resolving this conflict. And the easement is in perpetuity with this piece of land, and what you're proposing to do by restricting trees and vines would be in violation of that easement. And even if the Central Valley Farmland Trust was super nice and said, oh yeah, we want to help you and we want to do this, they could get sued. Or the Department of Water Resources will say, well, these easements conflict. How can we plan this $100 million flood bypass on top of this legal cloud? And so that's kind of where we are now, and Charlotte's here to share her perspective and her organization's perspective on the current conundrum. So I'll give you a pretty picture to look at, which is the San Joaquin River, right where the new floodway would, where there'd be a new weir on the Paradise Cut bypass.
Okay, I'm guessing I'm next. Again, Charlotte Mitchell, Central Valley Farmland Trust. And just to give you a bit of context, we're a nonprofit agricultural organization that works specifically with landowners, farmers, to put agricultural conservation easements on their land. It's a private contract between a willing seller and the land trust. And we ensure that there's a selection criteria that we have that allows us to navigate areas of the valley that are prime and appropriate to protect and ag conservation. These easements are in perpetuity, so the core goal of an ag conservation easement is to ensure that agriculture remains viable forever. And so that's a pretty daunting task, and so we take that pretty seriously in terms of what we look for to ensure that there is viability on that land to carry forth agricultural productivity-wise. It's important because, as you know, Central Valley has got some really uniqueness in terms of its prime soils, its climate, and is producing food not just regionally, but around the world. And it's important that we take that land preservation pretty seriously. It also provides a working landscape for the environment, a view shed, space between cities, and a variety of other things. We have grant funders that we often look to leverage funding, and that's how we compensate the landowner for the sale of his or her development right. And so they are precluded to turn their land into shopping centers and houses. They just got to keep it farmed. And our easements, while they're somewhat negotiable between the landowner to put in there and characterize what specific goals that landowner may have in terms of agricultural production, they leave for flexibility, and that is the key goal of agriculture. As farmers, we need to remain flexible in order to be viable. So if a crop no longer has the market content, we have to ensure that we can change that cropping type in order to remain in an agricultural capacity and viable as farmers. Flexible and crop protection materials also, we have to ensure that we're taking on the latest technology and the environmental regulations, again, crops and management techniques. We've got to answer and be flexible to each one of those as we move along. Certainly we're a different industry that we are today than we were 20 years ago and certainly 50 years ago. We got to keep that flexibility. We have to ensure that our ag productivity capacity is not impaired, and you saw some of that language. And I think that's an important aspect of our conservation easements, and ensuring that in this situation of Paradise Cut, there are trees planted in Paradise Cut. So that choice of that current landowner or any future landowner could be planting of an almond orchard, which is right next door to the current forage crops that this particular landowner is raising for his dairy. So that's key to an understanding that option does exist even in this floodway that currently is there present today. And certainly we want to make sure that flexibility can be there moving forward. The other thing I just want to conclude with and allow certainly time for questions and other panel members to speak is that we're supportive of this flood improvement of Paradise Cut as an agricultural organization. It's important to the agricultural community that surrounds it, the urban community, and we want to ensure that we're a working partner in this as we move forward. And that's why I am committed to work with John to figure out how we can do this in the confines of our current easement. I have an organization that has to be around for a long time, so we certainly want to make sure that we're not legally bind and put ourselves in a position where we have complications afterwards because of it. But I think there's opportunity to be flexible, and I think that's key to agriculture. It's got to be key to the working dynamics of this area as well. And hopefully out of this dialogue, we can be thoughtful about sort of how we treat and understand all types of easements. Here today, it's an agricultural conservation easement that's kind of making some complexities to this, and it could be another type of easement. So this thoughtfulness in terms of how we move forward and look at the future, I think can apply for various situations. Did I cover everything, John? Good. I'll move on.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to address the council today. My name is Nat Seavey. I'm a wildlife biologist with Point Blue Conservation Science, and we're a nonprofit organization based out of Petaluma. And we work across California to look for opportunities to protect ecosystems for the benefit of wildlife and people. And we and many scientists throughout California are looking to identify ways where we can come up with multiple benefit solutions to some of the really tough challenges that we have out there. And those multiple benefit solutions are in the way that we manage our lands such that they provide economic value, water supply values, habitat and ecosystem values, flood protection, and all of these different things that we want in our future. So one of the things that's really core to our organization is that whenever we do that, we do it in a way that we're thinking about the context of rapid environmental change. And one piece of that environmental change is the growing population of California. And in that context, we understand that there's increasing pressure for development, and easements are a fantastic tool in terms of protecting farms and protecting ecosystems from expanding urban sprawl. So you can drive by many places where land trusts are active, and you'll see signs next to farms that say protected forever. And I think what that raises a really interesting question about what does it mean to protect a place forever? And forever, I'm not going to tackle forever, but even just a 50-year time horizon, it's interesting to think about the amount of change that we might think about during that 50 years. That 50 years is going to see dramatic changes in technology. If you think about the way we farmed 50 years ago, we did not have GPS. So much of the technology that we use in farming today wasn't around 50 years ago. The economy is going to change dramatically, and the demand for different crops will change. Water availability will change. We see this right now when we think about California and the implementation of SGMA, which will require that less groundwater is pumped in order to meet sustainability, and that's going to mean fallowing some agricultural lands and potentially some managed wetlands. And then there's climate change, and climate change is going to touch California in many different ways, including sea level rise, changes in temperature and precipitation, and changes in the snowpack and runoff. And I know that all of the scientists that you have are working on these things, as was clearly demonstrated in all of the presentations I've seen this morning. So in that context, I think it's really important to think about a long-term solution for the Delta that has the ability to accommodate that change. And I think there's two specific opportunities for the council to provide leadership and guidance on that. And one is when we think about the conflict in Paradise Cut that's illustrated there, it's important to come to a good solution to that, because I don't think this will be the last time that we run into this kind of situation, and it's going to happen more as we think about rising sea levels and how we manage places differently as the environment continues to change. The other piece of it is that looking beyond Paradise Cut, as we think about what types of conservation mechanisms we want to put in place for the future, it begs the question, how can we make those conservation mechanisms flexible and adaptive in the way that they need to be? I think that easements remain an extremely important tool, and there are ways that we can look toward designing those easements such that they provide greater flexibility. I think there's also interesting opportunities to think about conservation of ag lands and of ecosystems in a way that it can be dynamic. And so there's work that's gone on by the NRCS and the Nature Conservancy and EDF to think about different systems for protecting ecosystem benefits and agriculture in a way that the places that those occur in the Delta could move around from year to year. And the tricky part of that is making sure that you have a system that's designed in such a way that at the same time it's dynamic, it provides some reliability. And the term that EDF has been using for that is dynamic permanence. So I think those are two exciting opportunities to think about the guidance that the council can provide on the future of the Delta and how we can resolve issues like this as they arise and make it possible to put these types of multiple benefit projects in place.
Thank you, all three. John, months ago you were here and you highlighted this paradigm shift of land use and easement conflict. You were optimistic at the time that a solution would be found. How's that going?
Well, I was optimistic more specifically about multi-benefit flood management projects and the idea of developing projects so that you're achieving different, multi-benefits. And so in the conversation I've had with Charlotte and her team, one of the things I've heard is, well, maybe you could just have the flood easement over the Paradise Cut properties, not the flood and habitat easement. And so we got grant funding to have what's called a flood and habitat easement, because they're doing the same thing that's just keeping the land in its existing seasonal agriculture that happens to be very good habitat for Swainson's hawk, and it's really good for flood management. And so when Charlotte pointed out, well, if there's no restriction, if you just did the flood easement and forget about talking about habitat and the restrictions on vines and orchards, that might be something that could work. And it's very, and I could go down that path. And we could get into more details about the problems of going down that path, but I could give up on the habitat part of it. But it's hard after spending years talking about and working with the Farm Bureau on, hey, farmland is habitat, and we can have farmland that's both habitat and productive farmland, and we can have multi-benefit projects, and then to hear, no, you can't do it here. Just have a flood easement. And that ramifies, because then if it's, when you start talking about the Department of Water Resources, and when you work with them, well, they can only pay for the flood, one division of DWR can only pay for the flood benefits. And another division could pay for the habitat benefits, and getting them to work together is still a major challenge. But I'm still optimistic about the flood plan, and I'm optimistic that I'm here today and that Charlotte's still talking to me, and we're just like thinking of every option available.
Charlotte, the existing easements that are in place have covenants that are in perpetuity. What's the chances of addressing this paradigm shift that's occurred? I'm a permanent crop grower, and I understand the restrictions that inundating that area could and the harm that it could do. But my takeaway all of these years is that the easements are placed to prevent urban sprawl, urban development. And so is there any thought, is there any opportunity to adjust the covenants of future easements to accommodate this situation that we find ourselves in at Paradise Cut?
I think so, and I think it's going to come regardless, in my opinion, with Sigma. That's going to change the way that agriculture, I think, is doing business in the future, and I think we need to be a little bit more understanding of how that's going to look. In terms of changing the current conservation easement, unfortunately, we can do an easement amendment, and it may look, to some degree. Department of Conservation also has a hand in what that may or may not look like. And so we come up to a roadblock, I think, of traditional ways of these easements being the way they are, which is which is largely kind of inflexible. And that's not just speaking from an agricultural standpoint, that's habitat and a flood, and you can sort of combine all of them. We need to look at an approach of dynamic, and I think Nat had talked about that. And in our current format, we're not. We don't have that flexibility because of the opportunities of grant funding that we get from state and federal sources that review and approve these conservation easements that we're putting on lands now. Is there an opportunity? We have to be respectful of the easement that's there, which is very specific language that doesn't allow for the ability to restrict planting of crops. And I think that's the roadblock, obviously, that we're at. And I think looking to the future, our organization is having discussions specifically around Sigma to ensure that our conservation easement has that level of flexibility in terms of that, and that also may lead into other types like floodways and those types of things.
Any questions for our panel? Ken?
How widespread a problem is this? I mean, again, is this, plans for restoration, or is this something that we're going to constantly run into? Or is this sort of unique, or you just can't say?
Well,
Whoever can answer that.
I'll just say that I was not an easement expert. I'm still not, but I'm learning a lot about them. And what I learned about these agricultural conservation easements is that the ones that are funded by the Farmland Protection Act.
Is that the Williamson Act? Or is that this is something different than the Williamson Act?
So land funded by the Farmland Protection Act always has these paragraphs that restrict agricultural capacity. And it's my understanding that the Central Valley Farmland Trust uses this language as standard language. So I think that there's a lot of easements that where this same kind of language exists. Normally, it wouldn't be a problem, but who would have, who you just don't know what someone's going to need to do in 50 years. Well, not somebody, what the state is going to need to do to protect the people of the state from flood risk or other things in the future. One option here that I don't relish at all, but it was one that was identified to me early on when I talked to lawyers about this, is eminent domain. The idea that you can actually condemn an easement. But that's a messy process, and in this case, and any dollars, anytime the land has been bought with state dollar, or anytime the easement was purchased with state dollars, you get into a real problem. Okay, we're going to condemn this, the state's going to condemn this land, and then we're going to compensate for the taking. It gets into an issue of paying the landowner twice for the same thing. We're going to buy this easement from you, and then we're going to condemn this easement. And we don't know how we're going to solve that riddle.
So, but a willing seller, willing buyer arrangement, you're not, the buyer of the property or even the property owner is not required to have to plant, or they could sit that year out. There's nothing, I'm not hearing that there's you can't voluntarily agree to, inundate the property whenever, conditions warrant it. Or you don't have to keep that land. Do you have to keep that land in production if the property owner doesn't want to?
Our easements say it can be fallow as long as it's available for agriculture. As long as somebody can pick it up, there's water, there's the infrastructure that's needed to farm.
And so you are making it doesn't seem like you're in contradiction with that. It is available for agriculture, it's just not being used, and it's getting inundated. I would, and I don't know enough, and this is the last part, and I'll yield this. I don't know enough about dynamic permanence, but if I'm spending $100 million and I want a specific benefit, and I may not get that benefit, I'm not going to be happy. And if I'm going out into the capital markets and I'm issuing bonds, and I'm disclosing to bondholders that this is the purpose of that, but we may not be able to do that because, of something like this. I think you've got, and maybe that's, depending on where the money's coming from. But I think those are the things that make this much more difficult to not nail down what you're doing. I mean, I would be worried about that. It's a lot of money.
So a couple questions. So please feel free to dismiss my questions because I'm sure you guys have thought about these before. So the first one is, would it be possible to extinguish the easement by unity of ownership and then reissue it with the terms that are a little bit more beneficial to what we want? And the second question would be, who has the right to enforce the terms of the easement anyway? Let's say with Ken's idea, if the land was fallowed with a vague idea that it could be used for agriculture in the future, but we were able to do the things that we want to do over the cut, who would enforce it? Who has the right to come forward and say, hey, this is not used for agriculture, if not the landholder? And if the landholder agrees to that, then why is there a concern?
It would be the land trust that it would ensure that the terms of the easements are held. We monitor that property, visit with the landowner once a year. There's a compensation. That landowner's growing crops for a reason, and it's in this specific reason. There's monetary reasons why he's doing it. So I think that certainly probably could potentially be a answer to it. But the other part of it is, would the landowner, forgive his financial benefit that he's getting for the raising of those crops. So there's that aspect. The economic aspect, I think, plays a very important part in this, and that's sort of the driver of why we can't really just do a flood management, because there's a valuation to that. To have just a flood and you're paying that landowner just for flood easement compensation, it's not enough for him to give up the right.
Could you fix that with legislation then? Could you pass something that said that, the person who gives up those rights gets a tax credit for the next 30 years or something like that?
Well, they certainly do get a, valuation credit on their tax for having it remain in agriculture. I think that could be an option. I would hesitate because there's a lot of land trusts that are doing similar work, and does that really open up the door to change conservation easements in any capacity for a long time by the legislature? So that would be my concern.
And what about the extinguishing part? I mean, couldn't you somehow by and I don't know if if that's impossible given the parties here, but couldn't you unify the ownership of the parcels and then that extinguishes the easement automatically and then you reissue it?
Well, I'm not sure if that can happen, and I'm not the attorney, and you're asking some really good questions. But from my perspective, extinguishing that easement is not one of those abilities to do. Eminent domain condemnation is, and that might definitely be the source that we have to go down.
Got it. Thank you.
We did have some really good lawyers on our expert panel. Steve Oliva, the former legal counsel for the Department of Conservation, now a retired annuitant. And Russell Austin is representing American Rivers. He's with the Murphy Austin law firm, and he does exclusively land conservation easement law. And I haven't heard them say we could extinguish it. Legislation has been recommended. The idea would be that you would have something very narrow, targeted, that wouldn't set a precedent. So we have kind of floated some language, but Charlotte's made it clear that her group does not support that, and we don't want to push something that sets a bad precedent. And I'm worried about the precedent it would set and the kind of the political negativity that it could create by trying to push something that could be very unpopular with the land trust community. And the last point I want to just clarify, I want to make it crystal clear that the vision for the bypass and for the piece of and the subject property is that it would remain in agriculture. And our expert panel concluded that the proposed habitat and flood easement would not significantly change the existing agricultural use of the property. What it would do is it would restrict the future planting of trees and vines, and that's what's prohibited by this easement.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Skip.
Just very quickly. you mentioned local support. I guess the question is who's supporting the project? Where's San Joaquin County stand on the project?
We have briefed the San Joaquin, two members of this, we've briefed a few different members of San Joaquin County Board of Supervisors at different times. I'm forgetting the names, excuse me. But two of them have sat on the Delta Conservancy board and voted in favor of the grant from the Delta Conservancy board to the San Joaquin County RCD to move this project forward. So I haven't heard any opposition and only support in the form of granting funds for this. The San Joaquin County RCD is actually the lead on on grants from the Delta Conservancy for this project, so they're very much in the driver's seat about how this project proceeds. The problem is they're everyone likes the flood bypass part. Charlotte even said she liked the flood bypass part. It's the messy precedent and problem we have with the easements that is making people nervous. And you can imagine if you're just downstream or upstream of the Paradise Cap bypass, you think it makes sense to forget the precedent and just go ahead and change the law and make this thing go through. And if you're from the Lodi area or somewhere that's not really going to be protected by this project, you're much more nervous about the bad precedent you'll be sending on changing agricultural conservation easements, and therefore inclined to say, I don't know if it's worth it anymore.
Oftentimes our comments are based on our experiences that we've had over the years. This reminds me of an experience that we're going through right now, and it's dealing with a restriction on some property at our Solano County Fair. And the restriction says that the use needs to be fair related. And, what bothers me is smart attorneys are always figuring out a way to get around that. And I think, I was looking at the staff report, and it harkens back to the Delta Plan. And it talks about that the Delta Plan wants to preserve, protect, and enhance the unique agricultural, cultural, and recreation characteristics. Well, I'm focusing on agriculture. To Charlotte's comments about there may be a time where, what's currently grown on the ground is not the highest and best use, and the cropping patterns change. And so permanent crops may be what is desired. And so, we have easements that protect agricultural land against development for a reason. And then once we develop out to the agricultural land, then we start blaming agriculture for all the problems. And it's local government that is allowed to annex, build developments, and then say to the local farmers, well, you're creating too much dust, you're creating too much noise. And to Nat's point about when you drove over here, you drove through Solano County, and you saw where we have distinct communities because we value our agricultural land. We have Proposition 8, Orderly Growth Initiative, that says we're a city-centered county. And so we actually, when you buy property in Solano County, on the tax bill, it talks about the right to farm ordinance, and that if you live in the country, if you will, then you might experience dust or noise. But that's what we do to protect agriculture. And when we have an easement like we're talking about today, it was put there for a reason, not to have some smart attorney come in and figure out a way to get around it. So I commend the trust. I don't envy you in your negotiations, but if we're really being fair to the agriculture community and really addressing the issue, which is we've been irresponsible in our development, and we want to protect 30,000 individuals, but why are they there? We ought to be talking about 10 or 30,000 acres of agricultural land that ought to be protected. So I guess, I don't have any sympathy for the project. I think my sympathies lie with the trust and how they're going to feel the pressure to change the easement or allow for some sort of a easement to overlay it, to allow flooding at a time. And that prohibits, to Randy's point, it will prohibit what can be planted there. And permanent crops probably will not be it, even though it may be the highest and best use. Thank you.
Can I just offer a clarification that I understand that perspective and it's fair. The flood bypass will lower flood stage, levee maintenance costs, and the risk of flooding for 10,000 acres of farmland. That farmland is much more likely to be able to be converted to its highest and best beneficial use because of the bypass being constructed. So this bypass isn't just about protecting urban areas. And by the way, the reason I got involved in this bypass is to try to stop the River Islands development, which took a lot of farmland. So we're on the same side when it comes to trying to stop reckless development of farmland. And we're on the same side. The bypass is designed not to take land out of agricultural production and to actually provide significant flood risk reduction for a much larger area along the San Joaquin River.
I'm going to let that be the last words on this matter for today. Nat, John, Charlotte, thank you very much for coming. Our staff obviously is going to be continuing to interact with you all, and we pledge our support towards resolving this matter because I was out there in '97 and I witnessed firsthand the benefits that could have been derived from having a flood bypass in that area for areas all the way up to Island Dairy, which Frank is very familiar with. So with that, thank you very much. And are there any requests for public comment? Okay, that completes file item number 10.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're on to file item number 11. We get an opportunity to hear from the chair of the Delta Independent Science Board, covering recent accomplishments and upcoming activities. Dr. Steve Brandt, welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the council for the invitation to provide you an update on our activities of the Delta Independent Science Board. And if I could start the slides. What I want to do today is just give you a very brief, just touch on our recent accomplishments, but really focus on some of our ongoing activities, and also provide a little background on what our real process is and how we go about doing our business, because it's been updated a lot in the last couple of years, and I think it'll maybe help you understand how we get to where we get in terms of our products. Most of you know who we are, and the Delta Independent Science Board, and we believe we serve the council, but also serve the broader scientific community. Now, our mandate is to provide the oversight of the scientific research, monitoring, and assessment programs that support adaptive management of the Delta through periodic reviews of each of those programs. In fact, it says we ought to review each program in the Delta every 4 years. Well, that's something that the board initially looked at and said, well, that's might be kind of hard. So rather than do that, the focus was to take a strategic review of reviewing the science, look at it and what we call thematic review. So we do thematic reviews of the science, and that covers multiple programs and multiple agencies. So that's kind of a broad perspective that we have. Sort of a secondary responsibility really is to provide scientific advice related to the Delta Plan, and oftentimes those are individual reports that are requested by the council, by the science program, sometimes by other agencies. So those are, think about that as two different types of things that we do. Our overall objective is to improve the science underlying the Bay Delta science programs, the application of that in science, which is an important aspect of it, and the technical aspects of those. Our approach is strategic. The various reviews we do are designed to try and improve that science, not necessarily say we need to do more science, but try and look at what might be valuable from a broader perspective and from an agency point of view. This is kind of a list of how we go about the kinds of things we touch upon. Primarily, we recommend in our thematic reviews the strategic science priorities. You can think about it in a way that if you really want to improve the science, and have it be more effective, let's look at the long strategic viewpoint. How could the science be improved? What are the gaps? Are there opportunities for different agencies to work together and enhance that effectiveness of the science and also the applicability of the science to management issues? We're hopefully that we improve research clarity and advance the debate about the Delta issues. And then, like I said, seek better connectivity between science, management, and policy. The thing we most enjoy about the Science Board is that we do not make or recommend policy decisions. We leave that up to you and others. We recommend science, and that is our focus. And that's good for a number of reasons, as you may expect, because of the conflict of interest and so forth. We need to be independent, and that's really why we stress that independent word as well. This is photos of our current members. And there has been some changeover, and that's sort of part of the plan. The members are appointed for 5 years, renewable for 5 years, but there has been a slow turnover, which is good for a number of reasons. I'm currently the chair. The chair serves 2 years. Eliz Canuel is the chair-elect, and as you know, Jay Lund was the past chair. We cover broad disciplines, and we also come from nationwide, and I think that's really healthy for us to be able to do that and get different perspectives from different regions and different areas, as well as a broad level of disciplines that we cover. In 2017, we completed, 6 major reviews. I've highlighted 2 of those. The Delta as an Evolving Place was one of our thematic reviews, and which Richard Norgaard gave you a presentation on that, I believe, in last July. And then the final EIRS for the California water fixes, as I think you all know, was a huge effort on everyone's part, and that took a lot of our time over the course of a number of years. I won't go really into any of these. The thing we also initiated as part of our process in 2017 was to develop our summary sheets for the thematic reviews. In various panels we've asked them, how can we be more effective in getting the word out in terms of what our reports are doing and influencing decisions and making things happen? One of those suggestions was to do a sort of a 2-page, what we're calling summary sheets. We've started to do that. I really don't expect you to read all of this, but this is the 2-page summary sheet for the adaptive management thematic review. And now we're producing these and we're passing them out at various meetings. These will be distributed, for example, at the Interagency Ecological Program workshop in the next couple of days and the Bay Delta Conference and things like that. But this is just one new way we've instituted to try and make our results more known for folks other than internally. Now, the thematic reviews that we do are sort of shown here, the process. We first need to identify what are the relevant topics to review. Initially, those thematic reviews were done on the basis of the themes of the Delta Plan chapters, which made sense that those are kind of overarching reviews that have been identified by the Delta, and those are things that are important to look at. But we're also now looking at other ways to do that through panels and discussions and getting public input to try and see what are the key topics. A new process we've instituted was to put together a 2 to 3 page prospectus on the topic. What are we going to review? What's the goal of that review? How we're going to do that? And then put that out for public comment so we can get some feedback and maybe change the nature of what we're doing or how we're doing it and just get from public and agency input on those. We draft a review for public comment. It goes out for public comment. We revise it and keep doing that until we get something that is acceptable. And the final review is actually reported to the council. Some new things we've instituted, as I said, one is the summary sheets, but we're also presenting our information at scientific conferences. We're also, in some cases, producing peer-reviewed scientific publications. We've just completed one last fall on the adaptive management report, and also presenting things at meetings in different agencies. We're presenting, for example, 2 papers at the IEP workshop in another 2 weeks on some of the results we have and where we're going. The methods we use, clearly we review the scientific literature. We have board discussions and debates. We often spend a lot of time on having a small work group that takes the lead in these reviews and meets individually with agencies and asking them what they think about the scientific topic. How can we make that science more relevant to them? And what do they see as the key issues and so forth. We go through sometimes very extensive individual interviews doing that. We also send out formal questionnaires. As John mentioned, we've instituted in the last year or so coordinating with the science program to have brown bag lunches to dealing with the topics that we're reviewing, as well as having that follow-up with individual panels that can help us provide input. Last July, we had a planning retreat where we invited a number of panel members from different agencies, academia, state, federal agencies, even the council. I think Patrick was on that panel, and we thank him for that. And the idea there was to try and look at what might be the next thematic reviews we should do. We asked them what are important to them, science issues, what are the regional science issues they would like to see us focus on. And also we asked them specifically, how can we make our reviews more useful? Either how we write them, how aggressively we should be in promoting the reports and reviews subsequently, and what kind of follow-up actions would be most effective. We got a number of recommendations from that. From that, we've put together we've instituted 3 new reviews. This is a current list of reviews, thematic reviews we're working on. It's quite a bit more than we normally have. Normally we're doing 2, sometimes 3 reviews at a time. Now we're actively engaged in 6 with the 7th, or 5 of them with the 6th one being formulated or already identified. The water quality science review, we've already completed a review. That has been out for public comment. We received the public comments back, and we're currently revising that review to have that done possibly as early as our March meeting in a couple weeks. I'll talk a little bit about the Delta Monitoring Enterprise and the Interagency Ecological Program more specifically, because I know that's of keen interest to the Council. We also initiated one on the water supply reliability. We're initiated one on ecosystems, and then we will also do a water quality science number 2. The ecosystem one is currently evolving, and ecosystems, as you know, it's in everything that the Delta does. Your poster out here says ecosystem health. The co-equal goals talk about restoring ecosystems and so forth. So from our point of view, what are ecosystems? How do you measure them? How do you define them? How resilient they are and so forth. And we're looking at how we can do a review that might be effective in order to help the Delta manage on an ecosystem basis. We will be reviewing the 3 reports that are coming out from the ecosystem amendments, and we think that is an excellent background for us to have, so we don't have to read those 500 and some papers. We will read some of them, but that'll be a good framework for us to develop our own ecosystem review in itself. The Delta Monitoring Enterprise Review, this is one that is it's part of our mandate to review the monitoring programs, and every time we've had sort of a retreat that says what should we be looking at, is to look at the monitoring programs. It's been one of the ones that came out. So we finally bit the bullet and decided to review the entire monitoring enterprise. That's a huge task. And we're lucky enough to team up with again, with the science program, who's providing some funding to do part of this. So part 1 of this is to do an inventory of all of the monitoring programs. What's being collected, who is collecting and funding it, why is it collected, and how is it used in management. That is a funded contract work. The RFP has been let for that, and I guess it'll be reviewed sometime in May to make a decision on who would be doing that. And that really we'll provide a extensive collection of data to find out for once and all who's doing what and why. Simultaneously, the board's going to be using that results of that report, of course, but we're also going to be independently doing our own evaluation from different perspectives, asking questions about how can the programs be better linked and coordinated, and our programs meeting the needs of management and so forth. We're doing that in a number of different ways, in part through the brown bag seminars we've talked about. We've had a series of panels on this to ask them specifically this kinds of questions. We've done a series of our own, looking at what literature review on monitoring, those kinds of things, and also questionnaires that we've been sent out. So that's going on simultaneously with the first part of that. I really know you can't read this.
Steve, Susan has a question.
Yes, Susan.
Dr. Brandt, could you go back one slide? In part one, will that inventory be able to determine whether a monitoring program has transformed into another monitoring program? You know how sometimes the program starts because of a certain source of funding and it either narrows or expands because another source of funding, and these things, sometimes it gets confusing, the original intent and the evolution to the current practices.
I think I would say yes, it should be able to do that, because one of the key fundamental questions we're asking is, why does this monitoring program get started, and what is it measuring, and what is purpose? And as you know, there's been a couple of terms out there in the monitoring field. One is compliance monitoring, and which has a very broad definition in terms of its what the actual requirements are, how flexible that program is, and so forth. To, on the other end of the spectrum, sort of environmental monitoring, which is more to look at the status and trends. And a lot of times those have evolved from one to the other, more or less. Environmental monitoring evolved from initial compliance monitoring, or has compliance monitoring has been used to evaluate status and trends. So asking folks why they started this program, what's maintaining it, what's funding, what's their future, how does it meet management needs, I think we'll get on exactly those kind of questions. Thanks. Okay, so this just describes a little bit more specifically about what we're asking, but I won't read that. Hopefully you can read it on your sheet. The other program we're looking at is the Interagency Ecological Program, which I know you heard about from last week, or last month. A lot of what IEP does is monitoring. So we think a lot of the things that they're involved in terms of coordinating monitoring programs will be covered within our monitoring. This is the one sort of, I guess, programmatic review we're doing. We view it more thematic because it is covering a lot of different agencies and so forth, but it's one that keeps coming up in all the times we have these panels, that this is something we ought to be looking at. So we also decided to look at the IEP, and that's primarily going to be looking at the science collaboration aspect of it, the integration, the use, how well it informs decision-making and adaptive management in the Delta. We've made progress on this. We've had a prospectus developed and had public comments on it. We're looking at documents. We've also, as John mentioned, we had the brown bag where Steve was the brown bag speaker and a panel in January. Our questionnaire is complete and being distributed, and I will be giving a talk on this at the IEP workshop in March. We will have our questionnaire distributed to all of the attendees at the IEP workshop, and also have it available for those who just want to pick it up and do it anonymously. So that will be very important to us in terms of this review. We have some upcoming requests. The council request, like I said, to look at the ecosystem amendment white papers. We'll be looking at the science, Delta Science Plan, and also we're discussing looking at the water supply adaptive management framework, and maybe others that we don't know about yet. This is a timeline that we've scoped out for through 2020. We do a number of other things that aren't really in terms of the specific requests that come to you and specific thematic reviews. For example, the Bay Delta Science Program, we annually, or when we go to that meeting, we review that and make recommendations how that might be reviewed. Last year, of course, one of our major activities was to help appoint John. We're part of the search committee, and not yet, so, well, we're keeping an eye on it. No, it's been great to work. Like I say, but it has been great to work with John because, like, not only in terms of the monitoring program, but in terms of jointly working on these lunches and not lunches, but brown bag lunches and the panels that follow. That's been a truly collaborative use of things that make sense to work together on. Our role was actually to make the final vote and make the recommendation of that member to the council. I know that council members are part of the search committee as well, but and a variety of other things we continue to do. But this is our timeline to give you some idea. I think you'll note that these reviews take a long time, and we do a lot of things. We try to be comprehensive. There's continual feedback from various agencies we get. We want to be comprehensive and make sure we get everyone's input, that we don't miss something, but we feel that they're important, and that's why we're also very interested in making sure that whatever we make as recommendations get implemented, and the reports just go on a shelf somewhere and stay there. Now, that's my report on the board's activities. I know we don't have much time, but I know that I was asked to say a few words on connecting data to management, data or science to management. So these are my own opinions after this. So take them or leave them, probably leave them, but last year I gave a presentation on bridging science to management to the Everglades, plenary presentation to the Everglades conference. And so I'm condensing an hour presentation into 3 slides. So to me, that question of bridging science to management or data to management is really a big part of what the Delta Independent Science Board's reviews are all about. When we make recommendations on how to improve the science, it's not to, in part, it's to improve the scientific excellence. What's missing, improve the scientific excellence, but it's also to improve the societal relevance. So we know that science needs to be used in management. The context of our reviews are always done within the context of adaptive management. So it's connected to science, to management is a big part of what our recommendations are all about, to make sure that they can be effective and the new science we're proposing or the science priorities we're proposing can in fact be valuable to management. These are just 4 topics: the adaptive management process, the ecosystem forecasting. Those 2 will have slides on. The science management communication and user tools. Clearly, if you're going to make science to management, you want to be in an area where you're actually providing tools that managers can use. That requires constant sort of communication from the very beginning, that if you're producing a model, you don't want to necessarily have a model that is on I want to say an academic's desk that can only be run by a supercomputer that has to be run through that process. You want a model that can be converted into a desktop usable, something a manager can use on a day-to-day basis. That should be sort of an ultimate goal of some of these things. Science management communication is clearly important, and oftentimes when I've been a manager. I directed a federal lab for 12 years, so I know something about this. Oftentimes, the science management communication is viewed as scientists need to be able to tell managers better what they really mean by the science. But it's a two-way street, and managers also need to be able to ask their questions in a way that science can address. And I think that's a constant communication kind of thing that has to occur so that there's a true understanding of what's going on. The last 2 slides I will, I guess I'm cut off because I can't get my next 2 slides. Do you have them on your sheet? There we go. Yeah, if you look at adaptive management, which is what we're all supposed to be doing, the connections to science, at least to me, are extremely clear. That when you set your initial goal of what, let's say, what your restoration project is going to achieve, in order to set that goal, you're using science to set that goal. Now, it could be a wild guess science, but you're using some scientific foundation in order to be able to set a realistic goal to take an action, And you use science to set up to set the threshold at which point you're going to change that decision. So if things go out, you make this decision, you're looking for this outcome, and the outcome's going off a certain way, adaptive management says you have to have a threshold at which point you reevaluate that and make that decision. That threshold is usually scientifically set. Your monitoring program that you do to assess the effectiveness of your management program is a science-based monitoring program. And then when you do the reevaluation, of course, that's also done by science. Why did this work? Why didn't it work? What do we need to do in order to change our protocol? Those science and data come into that every single way. So to me, the way to enhance, make data more effective for management, or science more effective to management, is really, put it through a formal adaptive management strategy. That's the way that those two can be married better. Another way is through, is now looking at the scientific community. And the scientific community can be far more effective for management. If you think about something that I've termed ecosystem forecasting, which provides a framework for prioritizing science. Ecosystem forecasting can be environmental forecasting. I've made this case before in various formats. But when you think about an ecosystem forecast, when you think about prediction, the best example I can think of is the Weather Service. If we do science to explain why it rained last week, that might be informative. And there may be ways to do that. But if you're doing science to be able to predict whether or not it's going to rain tomorrow, if you're a manager, you're much better, the science is much more valuable to you if it's in a predictive mode, if it's a forecast. To all of us, we decide whether or not we're going to take an umbrella based on a forecast. And you're not going to decide if someone tells you the science that explains what happened last week, which I call explanatory science. If you put science into a forecasting mode, it really does make you to think differently and prioritize science differently. If I'm going to forecast rain tomorrow, there's a variety of ways that I can do it statistically, or I can do it through driving forces, but it forces you to think about the drivers as well as the outcome. It's a different way of prioritizing science. And the little outline I put in here, the circle, is sort of first, for any particular topic, you do a needs assessment. What do people need to know? Well, I need to know if it's going to rain tomorrow, the next day, or the day after that. Then you do sort of the scientific evaluation of whether or not you can do it. You develop a model, you track your success, and then you improve to science to either improve that prediction or extend its time and space scales. In the Weather Service, they've done, at least I'm old enough to remember when Weather Service made predictions 1 or 2 days ahead, and now you can go online and get 10 days ahead. Well, that's all science that is driven towards improving those forecasts. When you think about something like I often hear, well, we can't do forecasts because it's too hard and it's too far away and so forth. But it's done all the time. It's done all the time you can forecast flows, you can forecast tides, you can forecast what the temperature is going to be. There's a whole number of things that are already available to be forecast and already being forecast, for example, within the Delta. To take it to the next steps, to be able to forecast things like harmful algal blooms, they are being forecast in other systems. In the Great Lakes, there's a formal NOAA harmful algal bloom forecast that's based on water flow and temperatures and weather and so forth. So those kind of things can be done, and they are a way of prioritizing science and actually bridging that data to the management. So anyway, that's my 2-minute lecture on that. And so I'm happy to take any questions if there's any time.
Steve, thank you. Any questions of Steve?
I'd like to make a request that such an important topic, and I had the pleasure of meeting the members of the Science Board with Randy a couple of months ago, it would be nice for us to just have some focused discussion, because I heard the desire on different members of the ISB to, hey, how do we get this information communicated to decision makers and policymakers and that kind of thing? And we had a real interesting discussion last month about, well, who are the decision makers? And we keep running into this issue of, well, we're only putting information up, and I think you're getting from policymakers, well, we want the answer. And I think it would be helpful for us to kind of explore that. I also am encouraged that you want to put out a perspective on the study before you do it, kind of a scoping to the public, and that's great. And you know, will we as a council be part of that process? So my ask is, Mr. Chair, is that we maybe have Dr. Branton, if he wants to bring some other members of the ISB, and really have that focus on communication of the science that's going on in the science program, the ISB, this issue of informing decision makers and who are the decision makers and what decisions need to be made to advance the co-equal goals.
John, what are the chances that this question would be answered through the 5-year review of the science plan?
I think that is going to be a big part of the 5-year update for the science plan. The science management or science policy governance is something that we are trying to address directly, that will get at that communication of. So I think what Steve highlighted was the scientists and the science community can't make the policy decisions. It's not that we want to drop the ball. We want to provide the information so that the right decisions can be made. And I think, as Steve highlighted, we're trying hard and thinking about how to make that information useful and available in a better way. But I appreciate your comments, and I think it would be useful. I mean, it certainly is a important topic that the more we can get input on, the better.
I think last month's discussion with Steve Culbertson really highlighted a lack of clarity on who the decision makers are and the different entities' roles, and I just think that's something we, as a council, need to understand, or at least get on the same page, or else we're just continuing to do this.
Yeah, I agree, and we're definitely very cognizant of that.
Steve and then Jessica.
Yeah, I think that certainly we'd be happy to do that. And I think it's something we've struggled, at least with our own reports. I know that when we did a report on the impact of flows on fishes, you know, I did present in front of the DPEC, which I think was probably the appropriate audience for that particular topic. We also, in collaboration, the board, in collaboration with the Delta program and the council, had what we called a science enterprise workshop a while back, and part of that entity was to talk about this topic as one of many topics, but try and learn from some of the larger regional things, like from the Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, Great Lakes, and Puget Sound, about how they deal with these same kind of, everything from science leadership to science communication. And there's certainly some lessons learned, and I think there's reports being evolved from that. So I'm looking at Jessica. But
there are a few things that we have planned for council meetings upcoming. So one, Steve, chair of the ISB, comes on a quarterly basis and presents to the council. So there is sort of regularly scheduled updates, and I think the focus of those is usually what their thematic reviews are. But this year, clearly, there's a lot going on in your reviews, both related to monitoring, which really gets at that sort of science governance issue, who's collecting data, how does that data get delivered. So recommendations coming out of their report this year, I think, would be great topics for those presentations, and then similar for the IAP programmatic review. Any recommendations coming out of those reports that come here, I think, will help feed that dialogue overall. We've also been discussing the idea of whether or not we should do a series of presentations at council meetings during the summer, so maybe June, July, August, just sort of in between IEP workshop, which is coming up in March, and then science conference in September, to sort of tag team with what's happening with science plan review. So Ken, I think you're certainly picking up on not just the dialogue here, but there is sort of a greater dialogue going around within the science community and the science management community about what's science governance look like, and what does the science enterprise look like overall in the Delta community? So we're certainly committed to continuing that conversation here at council meetings and through other venues too.
I would just add, I think we should know what can we do to further that dialogue and lead to decisions, specifically as the council. What's our role?
Thanks.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Skip.
Dr. Brand, putting an emphasis on the independent science board, when you review something coming out of this council, your comments, how are they received? Do you remember an instance where there was a total disagreement on an issue? How did you resolve it? In fact, are your reviews and recommendations, do you feel they're valued?
Everyone agrees 100% with all of our recommendations, I think, at least.
Okay. I have nothing else, Mr. Chair.
No, I think it's, of course it depends. In terms of the, when we put out our original draft reviews, and it varies from reviews to reviews in terms of the extent of the public comments we got back. Some cases we get very few comments back in terms of public review. We on panels, we often get a lot of, I do think we get a lot of praise, and people are very helpful, and people have said this has been very useful to us and so forth. I think in the water quality review right now, we got some fairly substantial public comments. They're all part of the public record, so we're looking at that in particular. One of the kind of comments we get, sometimes it's, well, you left this out or you didn't include that, and that's why we want to do that. In some cases, we're considering, in water quality as an example, we're considering those recommendations in our second water quality review. We didn't take care of temperature, now we're going to. In some cases, we've seen comments that suggest we need to identify particular agencies that should take the action that we're recommending. I think that's the one that came out in the adaptive management kind of report. It's coming out in water quality for us to target in a particular agency and say this agency should take the lead. We've had those discussions, and I'm not sure that we've resolved those, and they go from, in adaptive management, we talked about putting together a group and so forth, which I think is being taken as one of the recommendations. So yeah, I do think some of the recommendations are being taken. We recommended in the Fish and Flows to develop an integrated modeling program, and I know that came out recommended again in the science enterprise. Now there's an effort to develop an integrated monitoring program. I think the council took the recommendation. We write white papers, and so in one of our reviews, so the council is probably our best example of following up with a recommendation, council and program, I might add. But yeah, but I think that shifting science priorities. We normally don't recommend that a study needs to be done to look at this animal in this system. They're much more broad. They're much more interagency, and developing a sort of an interagency change in direction or interagency way of doing things takes time. And but I do think the stuff we've talked about in terms of data management, I do think those things are moving forward. I think the monitoring one will be a really major one, because there's a lot of interest in evolving amongst the monitoring community, and interest in evolving the collaboration and the way of doing business, and I think that our recommendations will be heeded fairly well on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, thank you. Thank you very much for coming and updating us, and for all the work that the Independent Science Board has done for the many years that you've been supporting our work here. I'd like to think that the Delta Plan reflects a lot of the recommendations that we got from you early on, and will continue to. So thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, next item. Is there any public comment requests? Very good. Okay, final item number 12, Water Masters Quality Quarterly Update. Michael, George, thank you for your patience. And Michael has 4 matters to provide for us today, and we look forward to hearing what you've been up to.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I don't mind exercising some patience because I always learn a lot. I think the presentations that you have before this board are really informative and they're extremely valuable. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to sit through it. Maybe we can go to the slides here because I recognize that I'm going to have to move quickly. I've got about 20 minutes, and there's a lot of work that's been done that I want to at least give you a high-level report on. So in terms of the overview, let me see, there we go. I want to talk to you about the publication of this consumptive use study. I've described it before. I want to tell you where we are and what we're going to do with it. I also want to describe something that we did earlier this week, which was to roll out a fairly comprehensive review of senior water rights throughout the entire Delta watershed, give you a quick update on where the State Water Resources Control Board is on the Water Quality Control Plan update, because it meshes importantly with the Delta Plan updates. I want to talk briefly about the challenges that we're running into and what we're doing about those challenges in terms of measuring diversions in the Delta. And finally, and probably most importantly, I want to talk to you about what we're doing in terms of climate change and how I think what we're doing interacts both with what's going on at the State Board, what's going on here at the Council, what's going on in other agencies. So first of all, the study of comparing 7 different methods for estimating consumptive use of crops in the Delta has been completed. The peer review has been completed, comments back to the peer reviews, and the final report has been distributed, among other places, here to your staff at the Council for final review prior to publication. This represents a major advance in remote sensing. 5 of the 7 methods for determining and estimating consumptive use of crops in the Delta, 5 of the 7 are remote sensing alternatives. By comparing them all together, by getting the scientists together to work cooperatively, we did significantly advance the science. The 7 different methods learned from each other, informed each other, came up with some best practices, and we moved the entire ball forward. That's going to be really important going forward, because how we measure consumptive use and what the impacts of water use in the Delta and in the Delta watershed is going to be critically important, particularly as we move into the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation, where we need to understand these interactions between productive agriculture and other uses with the restrictions on water use going forward. There are 2 big items that the study focuses on that we need to understand better. So we've gotten a lot of improvement in terms of crop water use. We need to look at the difference between fallowed land and cropped land. How much difference does it make in the Delta if we fallow crops in order to save water? We don't know that. We've got a pilot program that's fully funded that's going to be in the field starting next month for the 2018 growing season to compare 7 different paired areas where we're going to have a fallowed piece of property with nearby cropped land. We're going to look at the difference between them, where we hold steady soil types and elevation and microclimates and so forth. So that's ongoing. That's the next step beyond this. And then in future years, we've got to see how we can use particularly remote sensing to help us better estimate the evapotranspiration, or just evaporation from open water, the evapotranspiration of riparian vegetation, floating weeds, and all of that. Because as we do more restoration, we're going to be changing timing and amount of water use. We got to get a better handle on that. So that's to come, not yet funded, probably for 2019 and beyond. But the question is, how are we going to take advantage of what we've learned? And the first thing is, we have learned that remote sensing provides accurate estimates, and they're getting more accurate. They've gotten more accurate during the 2.5 years we've been doing this study. We think that's going to continue, partly based on the publication of this peer-reviewed science. It's a report, but it's also about a dozen very technical appendices that have been created by the various people here. And I think it's probably a gold mine for PhD candidates for the next dozen years to go deeply into the data sets that have been created and to advance the science. But I think very quickly after this is published, we're going to be able to say that certain ways of remote sensing crop consumptive use is quote unquote good enough for government work. In other words, we're going to be able to say it's close enough to make important management and regulatory decisions that are based on how much water is used for this crop or that crop or for this area. And so I foresee a situation where we can publish on the internet what I call, as a lawyer, a rebuttable presumption of water use. I think that's going to be important. Most people aren't going to want to challenge the estimate, but if they've got better data, if there's a reason for doing it, they'll bring that data forward. We'll have this kind of crowd correction, and we'll improve transparency and timeliness of this information, reduce the cost, reduce the invasiveness of it. One of the ways that that's going to happen is again, a funded 5-year program to create what's called OpenET, which is a web-based service you can pull up on your smartphone or your computer to make all this science meaningfully available to decision makers. So you can hone down on individual areas and get the data, get the insight, get the information from these satellite passes that are now going to take place every 8 days. In addition, we've got receptors, or we're intending to build receptors, so that we can take other forms of data besides satellite images. So we're getting more and more drone overflights that are being used to inform agronomy in the Delta and beyond. We're going to be able to improve that. And so there are important implications, both for the kind of long-term planning that is involved in the Delta Plan, but also day-to-day operations management and adaptive management. We're going to have much more reliable data that we can all rely on.
Michael, are you doing, you or someone else in the Water Resource Control Board, doing these studies anywhere else in the state? Consumptive use? Or is it only in the Delta?
No, it is absolutely other places throughout the state. There are 3 areas within the Water Board that are actively involved in this. The study that I've talked about that we've operated is specifically for the Delta because the Delta is so gnarly and complex. But we're also using this with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation team, as well as statewide by the Division of Water Resources. So this is clearly technology that has application elsewhere, and we're using it elsewhere, but it's so complicated in the Delta because of the microclimates, because of the changing wind patterns, because of climate change, adaptation, all of those kinds of things. So it's actually more evolved for upland farming than it has been for the Delta. And I think the important part of this study is it takes those tools and applies them into the Delta and gives us a higher level of confidence of accuracy. Second thing I want to touch on briefly is the rollout of the documentation about the staff's analysis of all the information that we got in 2015, because the State Water Board put out a request to all the senior water right holders, that is, those who have water rights which predate the state's administrative system for allocating water. And we asked them the simple question, how much water did you use in 2014, the completed year of the drought? How much you're going to use in 2015? We asked them to true that up on a monthly basis. But importantly, we said, and tell us what's the basis for your claim. Give us some documentation supporting your claim. So we got an avalanche of information. If we'd thought about it more carefully during the crisis, we'd have created a better template. We've told people how they could provide the data. But what we got was an avalanche of really valuable information with some limited term employees provided by the drought funding. We went through that data over the course of about 2.5 years. Responses from over 1,000 senior water right holders throughout the Delta, and they represent in aggregate about 90% of reported use by senior water rights throughout the Delta. And I'll show you a couple of maps in a second where that data comes from. But last week we posted all that material to our website. We also provided a spreadsheet that takes every single one of those 1,000 reports and gives a line item summary of the staff's analysis of that information. So it's a framework under which you can actually go and look at the individual water right level. What's the documentation supported? How and at what time of the year is that demand likely to indicate itself? So the areas subject to the information orders, the entire Delta watershed depicted in this map. This is the Sacramento part of that, so we're looking at just a part of the prior map. Here's the San Joaquin River watershed. Most of the rest of the watershed that we're talking about. And Mr. Chair, I see you looking for your own diversion down in Turlock. I assure you it's right there on that map. Yeah, exactly. I tried, but my graphics capabilities were limited. But now look at the difference. Next map I'm going to put up is the Delta. Smaller area than either of the first two watersheds, but look at the number of green dots. Every one of those reflects a senior demand that in aggregate reflects 90% of that senior demand. That is demand that is outside the state's administrative system. So you can see that of that 1,061 diversions, just quickly looking back, in the upper watersheds, those demands have been consolidated into irrigation districts or mutual water companies or reclamation districts. In the Delta, they remain pretty much unconsolidated. The good news is that we got 100% response, and this table kind of breaks it down. It's too small to really get a sense for it. But what we've got is the first comprehensive taxonomy of this demand, and particularly in the Delta, a significantly larger percentage of the total demand for water is represented by these senior water rights that are outside the state's administrative system. So this is the first time we really get a look at it. And one of the things I like to point out here is that a lot of the Delta, it's not so important what the data behind or what the documentation for your senior water right demand is, because you've got a wraparound security blanket of a contract behind it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on those. We know that those water uses are covered either by the underlying water right or by the wraparound contract. So this gives us a way of kind of focusing our attention. Where do we need to understand more? What do we need to put the emphasis? And I really want to emphasize here that we've put all this information and lots of tools that we developed through this analysis process up on the web, so other people besides those three areas within the water board that I described can make use of this. And one of the big things that we anticipate is, number one, we'll get that crowd correction. We'll get people looking at their line item and saying, the staff review of my documents missed some important aspects. I'd like you to take a look at this. In addition, there were 30 days allowed to provide this information. We know, particularly because of work we've done with the Central Delta Water Agency, that there's been an ongoing effort by the water community to develop these documents, historic records. The youngest of the documents that are at issue here, are 104 years old. So the effort to find the historical documentation, to organize it, And that's one of the things that we think is really going to be helpful, because now we've got a framework on which to hang the additional information. So we're going to get much better data than we've ever had in the past for this majority of water demand. And we're going to be able, therefore, to understand much better, particularly in future times of shortage, where that demand comes from, how it's used.
So this is excellent, and I'm excited to know that we have this data. I'm wondering, down the road, will there be an analysis of how this demand affects the timing of when the delta is in balance?
Absolutely, and I hope you could tell that I share your excitement about this. This is a tool that we just didn't have, and it required us in 2014 and 2015 to use gross tools to manage, fine distinctions, and it just didn't work. We're getting, through this process, better data. We're going to improve our methods and mechanisms. But frankly, I don't think the best or the most extensive use of this is going to be by regulators. This is going to be data that is going to be critically important to water managers, because they can understand better what their neighbor's use is, what the timing is going to be. They can find counterparties for time of year, time of crops, where they can make agreements and adjustments. So, either neighborly agreements or actual contracts that will improve everybody's reliability in forecasting. So I see this really as a tool primarily for water managers, because one of the things that I keep saying over and over again, based on my experience in the, I became water master in the last year of the last severe drought. I was struck by how little we understood about what was going in that black box of the Delta. The more we know and the more we can make that information available, the more we can empower the real heroes of the last drought, which were the water managers. We got through the last drought, worst drought in history over the longest period of time, without much economic disruption, because water managers had planned for it. Now, I also say that by the end of 2015, every rabbit had been pulled out of the hat, and if we'd had another dry year in 2016, a lot of those strategies had played out, had been fully used. And of course, the last time we had a drought, we didn't have Sigma. We're going to have that start to be implemented. So in the next shortage, the shortage is going to be meaningfully impacted by the increased shortage, if I can put it that way, associated with implementation of Sigma. So getting this information at this detail is going to allow water managers to better plan, to better make agreements among themselves and with others, including regulators. So I share your enthusiasm. This is important stuff. It's going to get better. We had hoped to roll this out while we were still kind of in a euphoric situation of a wet water year in 2017. Just before we rolled this out at the state board meeting on Tuesday was the hydrologic report, and you had the state and federal projects come in and present the impacts that we're seeing already. Yeah, we've got full reservoirs, but we've been dry since last March, and that's going to have impacts. So unfortunately, we may be using this information more quickly than we want, and maybe before we've had as much crowd correction as we hope to get. I want to emphasize here, though, the tremendous cooperation that we've had from the South Delta Water Agency, the Central Delta Water Agency, the North Delta Water Agency, local agencies in the North Delta. The Delta community has come together. We've got 100% compliance with the order, and we're getting tremendous cooperation in terms of hanging new information on the framework that we've developed here. Water Quality Control Plan, I'm going to go really quick here. Phase 1, we expect to have the responses to the comments. The comment period for Phase 1, substitute environmental document, San Joaquin River, flows and South Delta salinity, those comments closed March 17th, 2017. we're hoping to get the responses of those comments in within a year. And that sounds like slow bureaucracy. I can tell you it's been a lot of work and a lot of additional insight, which will inform updates to that phase one. Phase two, as you heard from Steve and others, the scientific basis report is continuing under review. It'll lead to a substitute environmental document sometime this spring. In addition, as WaterFix plunges forward with all the impacts that we've had through the changes and morphing to that project, and the state board's part of it, which is to review the petitions for changes in their water rights. Flow standards are part of that process, so it's something that the state board is focused on. And of course, we recognize, even though we can't be involved in it, that off stage there are voluntary agreement negotiations going on which may help us achieve closure on some of these things. Otherwise, I think we're looking at what is likely to be difficult decisions followed by years of litigation. Quickly, delta measurement, as you know, SB 88 passed at the end of 2015 with implementing regulations passed in January of 2016, has run into specific unintended challenges in the delta. So we pulled together this experimentation consortium, which has got all the major players in the delta focused on, instead of just rolling this out at great expense and then facing what we think would have been serial failures because of the challenges in the delta, particularly the use of siphons in the delta as compared to pumps in upland farming, which are easier to deal with. We've got programs of experimentation where, for instance, DWR has 18, and more than that now, but specific installations where they're implementing the measurement regulation, but also reporting on their failure analysis, their accuracy analysis. We've got the Freshwater Trust, the Nature Conservancy, again, the several different water agencies in the Delta, all collaborating, cooperating to do a series of experiments to figure out what works and how we can manage these kind of gnarly issues that we've run into. Among the questions those experiments are designed to help us understand is, first, is it possible to leapfrog the mandate in current law and regulation to measure every single diversion? Will the data that we're developing from this experimentation process support something? For instance, there's a whole experimentation process that says, well, let's figure out how to measure down to the gnat's eyelash at some of these gnarly siphons and figure out, can we extrapolate what we learned from one to several? So that if we've got, for instance, on McDonald Island, 50 different siphons, and we use regularly 20 of them, but we use strategically another 30 of them, can we measure 6 of them and extrapolate? We don't know yet whether the data will support that or whether we're going to have to implement measurement in every one of those 50 at very great expense and at high risk of failure. It's one thing if you're measuring 6 and you've got a failure, you can pour the resources into fixing it and make it, but if you're doing this at 60 and you've got failures every single day, that process becomes overwhelming. In addition, go back to the consumptive use study. Will real-time data from satellites supplant the need for diversion at each particular site? Because after all, in the Delta, pardon me, we've got no storage. So water that is diverted is either put into use, and ETs, consumptive use in the Delta, or it flows back into the Delta. In addition, looking forward, the difficulty of how we differentiate between water that shows up in the Delta either as natural flow or as reservoir release. So here's the last thing I want to talk about, how we're planning for climate change and how that impacts pardon me, with what you're doing. Our board adopted a resolution about a year ago directing everything we do within the State Water Board to take into account the likely impacts of climate change, similarly to what you're doing in Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan. We're both focusing on downscaled models for what it means in the Delta, and particularly the issue is sea level rise. Thank you. As we look at those models in CalAdapt, sea level rise is an existential threat to the Delta as we know it. And so we ask questions about, for instance, as Ron was talking about earlier, the implications for levee maintenance. Does sea level rise suggest different places where we need to put the initial emphasis so that we have more time to deal with sea level rise? Countering that, are there situations where we say the intelligent policy here is retreat rather than adaptation? What does it mean to restoration efforts? If you take a look at the Central Delta Corridor, where we're focusing the initial restoration efforts primarily because that's where the publicly owned land is, that's where we can understand better what that restoration effort is going to lead to. You take a look at that corridor, overlay it with the CalAdapt models of what happens with, you know, a meter of sea level rise, 3 meters of sea level rise in a 100-year storm event, you might say we're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic to provide some of the restoration in those areas that are likely to be challenged by sea level rise. So those are the kinds of really tough decisions that we're focusing on, that you're focusing on in Chapter 4, where it's not what's the best thing we could do, how can we save the smelt or save the salmon or do something like that's very specific, that puts us in that ESA single species straitjacket, but how can we look more broadly at what this ecosystem is going to look like, and how can we manage a vibrant ecosystem in the future that is destined to be significantly different than it has been in the past. So this is one of the graphics that Ron was talking about earlier. This is sea level rise within the Delta, the 100-year flood event with 1.4 meters of sea level rise. That's not a pretty picture. Now, it focuses us on the issue of how do we prevent that kind of inundation? What do we do with our levee strategy? What do we do in terms of using more restoration to allow areas to absorb more of that sea level rise? Flood control issues, some of the things that the Paradise Cut panel was talking about. But you take a look at that, and the first thing you say is, if our twin goals are to preserve the reliability of our water supply as it exists today is destroyed in this 100-year flood event with 1.4 meters of sea level rise. So that suggests some really tough trade-offs and decisions. But also think about what this means to protection of agriculture, what it means to the levee investment strategy. How do we make these tough decisions today? Because that's really the challenge of the Delta Plan. We're faced with these sea level rise risks to the future in terms of how we spend our time, our effort, our money today in order to either adapt or respond to this. So last thing, kind of observations. We are currently trying to thread a narrow needle where we've got entrenched interests on all sides, and anything that we do, anything that we propose gets litigated, because that's the systems that we've got. And so in the interim, while we go through this laborious, time-consuming, repetitive, go to the courts, get sent back, review, et cetera, the same kind of things that we're going through in the Delta planning process. While that's going on, the ecosystem, our water supply, and the Delta as a place are all continuing to deteriorate. So making any progress against our objectives is really meaningfully retarded by the system that we've got for what I call the Hall of 1,000 Doors. To get anything done, what we need to go through in order to overcome all of these. And just yesterday, we got a reminder from the Superior Court in San Jose about the mistakes we, the State Water Board, made in 2015 with respect to managing the last drought. Interesting, but what does it really tell us about the narrower window that we've got for managing the next drought? So that's all really negative, but when I want to be hopeful, I focus on two things that this agency has done. Number one, moving to One Delta, One Science to reduce the availability and the incidence of combat science, which informs and pushes this litigation psychology. And secondly, the Delta Plan itself and the necessity of making that Delta Plan legally enforceable. So these are, in my view, the potential harbingers of a path forward, a way to find the right balance among competing values, and I don't want to underestimate how hard that is and what a challenge it is for all of you. And in the prior discussions, I was struck by the number of scientific studies that are trying to be summarized in these syntheses. As a lawyer, I'm used to writing briefs, and I'm used to going to cases and trying to pull out that part of the case that supports the argument I'm trying to make for a decision that my client needs. That's not the way these synthesis papers have been developed, and I appreciate that. But one of the things I would love is when a synthesis paper or any other science references a study. I've gone to some of these studies, and it's not enough to say, here's the comment, we need that there's a connection between flows and fish, citing a study. That study might be 150 pages of carefully nuanced insight. If as a lawyer, you don't get away with citing the case. You have to cite the page on which that comes up. I'd like to see more analysis of what it is in that study out there that we're putting emphasis on, because there's enormous weight put on this lift that the Stewardship Council is asked to do. You're having to balance all of this kind of stuff. Those synthesis papers are really important, and I want to applaud your staff and the council for bringing the other agencies in and for making us take our resources and focus them on your process, because it's the only way you're going to hold all these agencies through the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, hold us accountable for what's in that Delta Plan by bringing us in early, letting us get our hands dirty, and it's an enormous use of resources, not just by you and your staff and your scientists, but also by the other agencies to review that work, to correct it, to add to the implementation process, and to think, where does this synthesis of the science interface with what we're doing, and what might we come into conflict, and therefore let's get into it now at this early stage, before it gets cemented into a Delta plan that we as an agency don't feel like pursuing. So I really commend it, and I think this is where we make progress in threading the needle. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Thanks for the update on those 4 matters and for affirming our work here.
And thank you for the water.
You're welcome. It's provided at no state expense, I might add. All right. Any requests for public comment? Would you like to?
2
say
questions.
something? Oh,
Were you referring to the Byron Bethany Irrigation District case?
Yes.
Okay, so you obviously don't have a comment on it right now, I presume?
Well, yeah, I got comments on it. It's a 40-page decision. It's an important decision. It disposes at the trial level of several issues, and it paves the way for phases 2 and 3 of that case at the trial level. So the case largely went against the activities of the State Water Resources Control Board, not just in the Byron Bethany case, but this was a consolidation of a lot of cases having to do with what we did in terms of responding to the late stages of the last drought. And by the way, I wear like a hair shirt the fact that the Byron Bethany enforcement was done under my authority as Delta Water Master. And it's an embarrassment. It was not handled as well as we could handle it today, partly because of better understanding, partly because of what we learned from the botched prosecution effort, which prosecution effort, by the way, the board dismissed. So we brought the action. It was dismissed at the board level. But a lot of important issues were brought forward in these consolidated curtailment cases. So there was a partial decision yesterday. It's complicated. We'll probably have more to say about it as we review it. We're reviewing it not only internally with our Office of Chief Counsel, with our Enforcement Division, but also with the Attorney General's office. So it's an important case. We're going to try and learn from it. It does suggest ways that we should proceed in the future to avoid some of the mistakes that the court pointed out to us yesterday.
And last question, Mr. Chair. The map that you showed about the 1.4 meter rise, you showed the blue map of the Delta. Did that consider the current levee system and sea level rise improvements that have been made?
As I understand it, and this is from CalAdapt, as I understand it, it takes a look at the current land use and current circumstances and projects at such and such a sea level rise what would happen in the 100-year flood. So the fact of the matter is that a lot of that inundation is likely to be managed in some fashion. And that's really the challenge. We know that that impact is out there. The challenge to us is, are we going to manage for it, or are we going to let it overtake us, or will it overtake us more quickly than we can get through this labyrinthine process of trying to make any decisions? So for instance, will we be able to actually implement infrastructure decisions, including levee maintenance and management, restoration, which could take some of the sting out of that 100-year inundation. In addition, a lot of what's going on in terms of adaptation within the lower estuary is important for ameliorating some of that impact. But yeah, what you see there in that map I showed is in a circumstance of 1.4 meters of sea level rise at the Carquinez Straits, coupled with a 100-year flood, you'd have a lot of levee failure of the current levees.
yes.
Member Thompson know that we are aware of the curtailment decision that came out yesterday and are analyzing it now in anticipation of an update next month. As Mr. George mentioned, it's a long decision, and there are some significant implications for pre-1914 rights that we want to get right in an update for you all next month.
Great, thank you. All right, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. We are on now to file item, well, we actually have two file item 12s on the agenda. So the next file item 12, public comment, brings me to a need to comment. And that has to do with my colleague and friend, Senator Patrick Johnston. I met Patrick for the first time officially on April 1st, 2010, when we convened in the Secretary of State's auditorium for the first ever meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council. And over the almost 8 years that I've had the opportunity to work with you, meeting at least once monthly and then sometimes 6 and 7 times monthly, you have been a stalwart. You have been an absolute inspiration to me and to so many others. You have brought to this council a steady hand, a wise and experienced, knowledgeable understanding of Delta issues. You have been a fair arbiter of many of the issues that we've had to wrestle with, and I so much appreciate the opportunity to have had the chance to work with you and to learn from you. You're going to be missed. You're going to be missed. And so that nobody loses the context of this, this is likely to be Patrick's last meeting. He is concluding the second of a 4-year term. And so I want to provide my colleagues and friends and even those of you in the audience that would like to comment. And then I have a little presentation to make, and then we'll give you the opportunity for the last word.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Patrick and I were talking at the break about the Delta Protection Commission and the legislation that he co-authored, or did you author it? And I think it changed what we know as our Delta for many, many generations. And so I just want to tell Patrick how appreciative I was of someone who's worked on the Delta Protection Commission a couple times, and as a member of the Board of Supervisors in Solano, that values our agriculture, the Delta as we know it today and for years to come. So thank you very much.
So Patrick, I want to echo what Randy said about learning from you and how it is such an honor to work with such a gentleman. I've learned so much from watching how you approach particular problems and question the information being presented. I have to tell you, early on in my career when I was working for a gentleman named Bob Potter at Department of Water Resources, he was a deputy director and then a chief deputy director. And we were trying to address some problems in the Delta. And he said, I want you to study this. And he gave me an article about this gentleman named Patrick Johnston, who had introduced this legislation that also in Bob's mind and many people's mind really was landmark legislation that changed how the Delta was viewed and how it would be managed. And I never imagined at that time that I would actually have the privilege of working with you. So I will miss you.
This is my first experience on a policy board. And Patrick, just being able to kind of watch how you conduct yourself and just the way that you get to the issue and you ask the right questions, I mean, that's been quite a example for me. I think everything I've seen that you've, these almost 2 years I've been on the council just shows me what incredible legislator you are and have been. I just have, so much respect for you and appreciate it. And, Sorry to see you go.
It can be.
If you have to.
I know, I've known this fellow for, geez, I want to think about 40 years.
Yeah, right.
And we go back a long way, long before he was in the legislature. And one of my best friends. So, and my seatmate here for the last several years. And I told him, and there's all these encomiums are well-deserved, the comments are even richly deserved, but I was just going to write the word phooey, because I was so disappointed that we didn't keep this guy on this council. And I still feel phooey about the whole thing. So I'm not just losing a seatmate, I'm losing a close friend for the time being, although we do get together periodically, so that part's good. But I just would underscore everything everyone has said. And certainly has been my mentor in many ways on this council. In fact, generally that's what I look to as Pat's leadership in this council. Not that I'm trying to denigrate Randy or anyone else's, it's just that he's sitting next to me, so I ask him a few things and he usually has the answer. But in any event, phooey.
Okay. As you know, you've observed a few retirements in the past. We provide a certificate, but I guess that you probably have apple boxes full of certificates that are in the garage somewhere. So we wanted to provide you with something a little more usable, and that is a piece of artwork. This is the scene near the Grand Isle Mansion on the Sacramento Delta near Walnut Grove, California, as seen while flying over the river in a 1940s Piper Cub. It is a watercolor by Elaine Bowers, a very famous artist in the Delta, and in appreciation for your years of service, I want to present this to you. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Randy. You've been the wise leader of all of us for these years, and your leadership with Susan has guided us. And Skip and I go back a long way for the early days of the Delta issues, and I remember that, and it is good to be able to serve again with you. And Ken, who's brought so much knowledge that typically a board like this doesn't have to this enterprise that we're in, has been really helpful, and I've learned a lot from that. And Mike's experience in the legislature and elsewhere has helped. And my best buddy, Judge Damrell, we go back a long way and we continue. And his contribution to this too has been unique in advising us and helping us all in an area where it is a thicket of laws. So thank you all. Over the 8 years since now Mayor Darrell Steinberg and the State Senate appointed me to serve on this body, I've always looked forward to coming to these meetings, always, because when we get here, we serve with committed, thoughtful colleagues, and we have a staff that is smart and dedicated and ethical. And some of them are here, and some of them are upstairs, and some of them have moved on, to be sure. But Jessica and John and Bethany and Amanda and Ryan and so many others have assisted us and really been our partners in pursuing what the legislature and the governor gave us in the Delta Reform Act. And so these meetings also were the occasion to have presenters, whether it be panels, And I thought Michael George was terrific today. I thought this was such a satisfying last presentation for me to hear. And you've really gotten good. It's been good. And for whether it's agencies, the Delta Protection Commission, or Delta Conservancy, the Water Board, all of those have added to our knowledge, and other agencies and certainly other organizations and individuals that have testified. I think the council itself contributes to a better water system and a better delta, and it's the oversight function, and it's the enforceable management plan of the delta that has continued to drive this and was referenced in the last panel and continues to be our work together. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison charged the first Congress, of which he was a member, with reasoning on the merits of public policy. And so the council, members and staff, we're not stakeholders, we're not interest groups. We accept that the co-equal goals are the guiding principle and the legal template that we're here to implement and follow. And so we do that by paying attention to science, by listening to everyone, by trying to keep an open mind, by asking questions, so that ultimately we collectively are reasoning on the merits of public policy. That's what we do. Goodbye.
Let me conclude with a quote from Stephen Covey, who said, "It's not about what you accumulate, it's what you contribute." So in honor of all that you've contributed to this agency and to our lives, I adjourn this meeting in honor of you.
This is nice.